Welcome to The Future Strategist with James Miller. Today, I have again on my podcast Gregory Cochran. Oh, hi, Greg.
Hello.
So we are going to talk today about the genetic history of Europe. And Greg knows vastly more about this topic than I do, so I'll be mostly asking him questions. So, Greg, from our previous conversations, I understand we've learned a lot recently about the genetic history of Europe, and why is that?
Well, the fundamental reason is advances in genetics of two kinds. Part of it is more advanced analysis of the genetics of living people. The other part is analysis of ancient DNA, which we have quite a few examples from Europe and related regions where things are well enough preserved going back thousands of years that we can get pretty good information.
So, I have my DNA scanned by 23andMe. You're saying we can do basically the equivalent with, bodies that are thousands of years old?
Usually not quite as well as that, but we can. But see, there's tremendous amounts of information if you do this perfectly. There's billions of bases of lots of information. The quality varies on how well they can do it with bodies from the past. Sometimes it's almost as good as a living person. Other times you get partial information, but partial information might still be, a very large amount of information compared to what you might be able to see from just say the shape of the skull or something. There's a lot of information there. So sometimes they can get intermediate amounts of information that are still enough to tell you tremendous amounts.
Okay. And what's the approach for using this information to figure out what's going on in Europe's past?
Well, they have systematic ways of calculating whether, for example, two groups, for example, have sort of split so that they are, or you can systematically see if somebody must have mixed with someone else to generate the patterns you see today or see in ancient DNA. You can tell if one group is related to another. You can tell just, going over time, to various extents, if it's descended from another group. We see things like this on an individual basis where somebody gets their genome scanned and it tells you that most of your ancestry is from group X and most is from group Y. We can do similar things with ancient DNA, and we can do even more once we have a number of different samples of ancient DNA, things of that sort. So
okay.
you can trace family trees and you can trace admixtures.
Okay, so 23andMe figured out I'm half Ashkenazi Jewish and my son is 3/4 Ashkenazi Jewish, which is right unless people have been lying to me. So we can do kind of the same thing with people with DNA from ancient bodies.
Right. And another thing which we can do to some extent is we can see, suppose you had a group that has been in a given place a long time and is not mixed, which would be unusual, but because they can still change, they might change by natural selection. And we can see some of that too.
Has there been enough time for natural selection to have worked? Given how
Some,
far?
yeah. If we're talking, let's say since the beginnings of agriculture in Europe, which might be 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, the answer is at least some, yes.
Okay. So let's imagine that one group conquered another. Could we distinguish between them conquering the other group versus them just sort of coming together and living in harmony?
I don't know if harmony is all that common, but sometimes we could. Sometimes we might not be able to. One guide to this is if we look at examples in history where we actually do know what happened, that should tell us some of the things that are possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, for example, you might look at Latin America. In some countries in Latin America, let's say Mexico, the ancestry is a bit more than half American Indian, more like 40% Spanish,
mm-hmm.
something like 5% African.
Okay.
Now, you could imagine they all, had a big picnic and decided to stay there. Of course, you would have to throw away all of written history since we actually know what happened. But there are hints in the genetics. If you look at the Y chromosomes in Mexico, they're majority, I don't remember exactly how much, but more than half Spanish. Whereas...
So the Y chromosome, that just goes from father to son, right?
True. Right.
Okay.
So it tells you something about the male part of the ancestry. But in Mexico, although the overall ancestry is more than half Indian, the Y chromosome ancestry is more than half Spanish. Or if you looked at the...
Okay, so wait, how could that happen?
If Spanish men marry Indian women...
Okay, so if the Spanish men marry Indian women, and then the Indian men didn't do all that well in terms of reproduction,
right,
then you would expect today we'll see the Y chromosome matching that of Spanish people.
Well, again, not entirely, but it's, you see more Spanish Y chromosomes than you see overall Spanish ancestry. So that tells you that, to a significant extent, it was more Spanish men and Indian women. I'm not saying there are no American Indian Y chromosomes. There are some, but they're less than half. I don't remember the exact number, perhaps 35%, some 40. Another way you can do a similar thing is you look at mitochondrial genetics. They come only down the female line.
Okay.
And so even though, like most ancestry in over all of Mexico, I think this varies from place to place in Mexico and from group to group. But although most ancestry overall in the other chromosomes is Indian, even more is of the mitochondria are American Indian. But this all fits with what history says. The people who came from Spain were mostly men. They mostly married Indian women. This is well known. It's documented in some detail. There were some Spanish women who moved over, but not so many compared to the number of men. So there's no real mystery about this, but the genetics fits with what we actually know, which is encouraging. But the point is, if there was a population that had a similar pattern where we did not have a written record, we could figure out that in some ways it was somewhat similar to what happened in the Spanish conquest of Mexico. At least in terms of the genetic pattern. That doesn't tell you exactly how people interacted, but it gives you pretty strong hints.
Yes. Okay, so we're saying if we detect differences in the Y chromosome compared to mitochondrial DNA, then that can tell us which people reproduced and perhaps where newcomers came, whether newcomers were male or female.
Yeah, and both are possible. The question is how often they actually happen. Not so much in Europe, but this is an example. People have been interested in Polynesian ancestry, mm-hmm. and they found the language and most of the cultural baggage started out with a group that was on Taiwan.
Okay.
Influenced by people in South China. They developed some very good methods of sailing and explored and settled many places, mm-hmm. some of which already had people living there, some of which had been uninhabited. But today, Polynesians, maybe 70% of their ancestry is of this Taiwanese sort, but about 20% is from people more typical of New Guinea, mm-hmm. which is a fairly different group. And although about 20% of their total ancestry is from New Guinea, something like 70% of their Y chromosomes are from New Guinea.
Oh, so it was the men who went exploring.
Well, no, what it was this. We now have some ancient DNA from early days in the first islands settled in Polynesia. Mm-hmm. And in those days, it was all Taiwanese.
Okay.
The first guys who got there were all Taiwanese.
Mm-hmm. And then the newcomers.
Then, apparently, somebody came and conquered them and largely replaced the Y chromosome lines, but without bringing very many women along. So the rest of the genome did not change so much. So what it looks as if is an early set of Polynesians who were essentially all Taiwanese in their ancestry, or very close to that, landed in places like Tonga, which had been uninhabited before. Mm-hmm. And then, sometime later, basically a bunch of guys, probably almost all guys, came from somewhere settled by the sort of people who live in New Guinea, which could also include the Solomon Islands, and conquered the place. Mm-hmm. They did not change the language, but they must have killed a lot of the local men and replaced them.
That sounds like there was a scene in Game of Thrones where there was a group of men that were sort of giving up on what they were doing, and they're like, hey, let's just go find an island, we'll kill all the men, and, we'll have children with the women. So they're saying
clearly we should not have let Los Melanesians watch that show.
Yes, well...
2,000 years ago.
You watch TV and it causes acausal violence. Okay.
But by the way, some people attempt to construct scenarios where this happens in a peaceful way. In this particular case, I don't think that's very likely.
Yeah, this would be the men are like, God, you guys are just, you newcomer men are so much better than we are. Please take our women. We'll just, we'll just go play video games for the rest of our lives. And
well, I think there may be some people like that in the video game community, but I did see somebody suggesting something like this, and this will come up again when we get to certain points in European prehistory. I will bring it up again.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so why don't we turn to Europe? So I know the anthropologists were teaching us that, if you see, we observe changes in the artifacts, like changes in pots, but the anthropologists have been telling us, well, that's all due to trade. It was mostly people stayed where they were. Maybe they migrated peacefully, but there really wasn't violent clashes or anything. So that was sort of the prevailing academic view, I think, until recently. Is that right?
It's come and gone. Now, for example, think roughly what time were you taking a course where people said like that?
Oh, a long
where people
time.
talked like that?
Yeah.
No, by my standards, quite recently.
Okay.
Say what decade? The 90s?
Yeah, that's 30 years ago, maybe.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what they were saying then. And that's probably what some of them are saying now. But if so, they're going to have to work hard at ignoring the recent genetic evidence. But if you go back further, which, by the way, it seems like a long time even to me, but if you go back to, say, the 1920s or 30s, people did not say those things. They assumed that, at least in many cases, perhaps most of the time, if you see a big change in the customs and the artifacts, like, say, going from a level to a shallower level, which is more recent, archaeologically, you say, well, previously these people built, they were agriculturalists, they built long houses, they lived in little villages scattered through Germany, and then we go to a higher layer where there are no buildings at all, and the only thing we find of the human efforts are graves where people are buried with war axes.
Yes.
Okay. People in, say, 1926 who already knew some of this stuff, not as well as we do now because they didn't have carbon dating, for example, and many other advanced tools. They assumed that somebody had come in and conquered the other people, perhaps killed a lot of them, and taken over. That's how people used to talk about this. Post-World War II, people increasingly decided that they didn't like that interpretation, and they talked more about various kinds of peaceful change, trade. And by the way, there's some logic to it, in the sense that when you see a new kind of artifact, someone had to originate it somewhere. It can't endlessly be traced back to another group it came from. Someone must occasionally invent new things, or there won't be any new things.
Yeah.
Now, but the other question is, how many, when you see something new, is it usually borrowed from somebody else, or is it usually original or local in its origin? And it probably depends. But, typically, if you started speaking English, for example, and driving a car, the odds are you didn't invent the language and the car by yourself.
Yeah.
Unless you're, really clever. So we all know there's a lot of imitation. We also know there are examples in recent times which, like, why are people serving gyros in a Greek restaurant? I said, 'cause they're Greek. Because that's what they do. Of course, there's other things like, why are they selling chow mein in a Chinese restaurant? I says, I don't know. Nobody ate it in China. We kind of invented it here. So, both things are possible. But it's generally true that long-range communication is a lot easier today than it was then.
Yeah.
Long-range travel. And the fact that the Japanese drink Coca-Cola, that's an example of a widespread cultural thing, but that may not have happened quite as much 6,000 years ago. In fact, we're pretty sure certainly Japan was not imitating a lot of Western customs in those days. Any rate, so archaeologists increasingly became, and I don't quite know the word for this. They rejected explanations that involved lots of migration, populations conquering each other, populations replacing each other. They tended to be against those and usually assumed that there was something wrong with any explanation of that kind.
Okay.
They were wrong.
So they're basically saying that Conan the Barbarian interpretation of history, that was completely silly. That was pure fiction. And that Hitler was what Hitler tried to do was very anomalous.
Having somebody do a lot of something is not a good way of proving that nobody does things of that sort.
Well,
although that's sort of the reaction. People said, well, Hitler did a lot of things like trying to replace groups and exterminate groups and move people around. By the way, Stalin did a certain amount of that too. But somehow many people's reaction was, well, the fact that it just happened proves that it can't. Oh, speaking of Conan the Barbarian, that series of books was written by a guy named Robert Howard around 1930, and he got a lot of his ideas of the way typical way things might work, not counting magic and monsters, from contemporary books on archaeology and prehistory.
Oh, okay.
And that's one reason that, for example, there is a piece in which he sort of talks about the background of, sort of like the story guide for all these stories, the history of the world that these stories are set in. Called it's an essay called The Hyborian Age. And if you look at it, it's a lot closer to what you see in David Reich's book than most contemporary archaeological work. And his general picture of how the world works was apparently, except for perhaps too much magic, was more accurate than the most typical book on prehistory by professional anthropologists or archaeologists. But it's not because he came to all these conclusions by himself. He was reading what was popular in 1930. What was popular in 1930 was on the whole, not everywhere, but on the whole, more accurate than what people were writing in 2010. It's a good example of the inevitable progress of science.
Yeah. Or turning away from science for reasons of politics.
Well, sort of. Although, I had never completely understood this. But another thing is that it wasn't just movements. A good part of this was discounting violence as an important factor. Although there's obviously an awful lot of it in written history.
Yeah.
But people, the general picture that was sort of considered the null model was that prehistory wasn't very much like actual history. But there's some ways in which that's true. For example, if you're talking about the part of it that involves writing, well, people weren't doing it yet. And there were other more complicated customs that didn't exist yet. People traded, but they didn't yet have money in the form of coins. There certainly are differences. But, the idea that, things were much more peaceful in such situations, that was a mistake.
Okay, so let's turn to Europe now. So
yes.
What's the starting point? What do we know about the first people in Europe?
Well, there have been some kind of hominid in Europe for a long time, probably more than 1 million years. And
what does the term homonym mean?
Something like a guy.
Okay, so human-like.
It's a wider class, but it includes humans.
Okay.
So in practice, it might mean Homo erectus, it might mean Neanderthals, it might mean Denisovans. In terms of groups we at least know a little bit about, have some skeletal information. But most of that is, a distant prequel to our main story. But you could say there were groups like Neanderthals and earlier groups, perhaps, that we would call archaic humans, close to modern humans in some ways, but probably significantly different in others, that existed for a long time in Europe. And then about 45,000 years ago, modern humans showed up and largely replaced the archaic humans, the Neanderthal. In Europe, that would mean Neanderthals. We have But interestingly enough, those early humans, now by the way, they also mixed with Neanderthals some. We know this. Essentially everybody outside of Africa has a little bit of Neanderthal ancestry, maybe a couple of percent. And which probably happened early, since you see it everywhere. It probably happened somewhere in the Middle East, which is sort of the first step you take as you go outside of Africa.
And you actually predicted that, didn't you, in a book you co-authored?
Yeah, I thought it likely. My argument was that Neanderthals had not separated from modern humans so long ago that sterility or the inability to breed was very likely. We know many examples of species of mammals that are essentially, sister species. They split apart. We have estimates for how long, and sometimes they have problems reproducing if they've been separated long enough. But we know how long that takes, and it's longer by a factor of 2 or 3 than modern humans and Neanderthals had been separated. So it was likely that we could reproduce with them, maybe with some occasional problems, but most of the time you would get babies out of it. And part of it is my picture of humanity, even ancient humanity that we don't know a whole lot about, says things like that would happen occasionally. Now, a few people had, I think most people were arguing for biological incompatibility, but there were a few people saying they were too different. We had high moral standards. We would never have done anything like that. And I said, well, if so, those high moral standards have decayed with time. Because I know of examples of people who did some fairly surprising things.
Well, the fact that we have laws against bestiality is a sign of certain things that must be happening for the fact
well,
that
it proves it must happen at least occasionally.
Yes.
And it does happen at least occasionally. Yep. Or for that matter, people just having sex in ways that they wake up the next morning and say, my God, what was I thinking? Yeah, well, that happens, but maybe they weren't thinking, and those things do happen. Although, it wouldn't really surprise me if there are at least a few cases where they kind of got along. I mean, nobody knows, okay? Yeah. My favorite scenario involves some young human woman who's like bathing in stream, and she's seen by this Neanderthal hunter coming back. And by the way, we now insert a bunch of prose which I've ripped completely out of a bodice ripper novel. And then, and they try to communicate. And at last, his near manhood would no longer be denied. Okay, anyway, enough of that.
Yeah.
They were different. We don't know exactly how different. We know something about artifacts. We know that Neanderthal artifacts were simpler than ours and that they changed slowly compared to ours. And so you have to think they were different. There's certain other things we did that they did at most very rarely, such as, fairly complicated burial rituals. But we don't know everything. Like only recently we found out that it appears that they would collect the claws of things like eagles and hawks and use them as decoration of some sort.
So they have some art. But we were probably smarter than they were.
I would guess yes, but I don't know. There are 6 other possibilities. As it's clear that we largely replaced them. That much we know. We also know that we picked up a few genes from them that have become relatively common because they were somehow useful. Some cases we have a little idea of why they're useful. We have found some things which are probably
just to go back to that. How do we know that? The fact that we picked up genes from them, why does that imply that the genes, at least back then, were useful?
If the overall level of Neanderthal mixture is something like a couple of percent, and you find a particular gene which is at 50%, it turns out you can make a pretty good argument that it probably did something useful and spread because it was more useful.
Okay.
By the way, there are other Neanderthal genes that nobody has. Apparently they didn't fit very well with modern humans. Mm-hmm. So both things happen. So, there are some things that got gradually reduced or even eliminated. There's other things that became quite common. There's a bunch of genes involving keratin, which is the main protein in skin and hair, which certain variants involving keratin are like 50% frequency in Europeans. So some of the genes involved that affected Neanderthal skin and hair are now common. I don't think people have gotten down to finding exact details of what those do, but we do know that. We know that, for example, what were some other examples? There are some genes involved in the immune system, which were Neanderthal versions have been picked up and are now common in people in Europe, and also in many of these things apply to Asia as well. Mm-hmm. People in Asia may also have, since they also have Neanderthal ancestry, they too have high levels of high frequencies of at least a few Neanderthal genes that have somehow turned out to be useful. We understand some of what these things are. We don't understand all of them.
Although they don't have to be useful now, right? They just were useful.
Well, they have been useful on the whole over the time since. In fact, some of them it might have been some of them were more useful in the past and not today. It could have been that some of them weren't especially useful until perhaps the world changed in some way, that they, like there could be a Neanderthal gene that was useful among people who were farmers, but it wouldn't really increase until farming was invented. So, we don't know.
Oh, I see.
But actually some of it we will get to know, because if we have enough ancient DNA samples, at some point we can actually trace how these things change with time. So we might know some of this. Like one thing we do know is that for your generic piece of DNA from Neanderthals, on the whole, with important exceptions, they've gradually been decreasing. So if you just took a random chunk of a Neanderthal chromosome, it works slightly less well in humans than the typical human version. Mm-hmm. So there's been some, probably it went, like what was once the 3% in mixtures, in terms of in areas where the genes actually do something, is maybe now down to 2. There's been some gradual decline.
Okay.
But at any rate, so we had early people moving into Europe, and now all of this is affected, greatly by where the ice ages are. During the ice ages, some of Europe, or a little of Europe, or it depends on what phase of the ice age you're in. There are times in which only southern Europe is habitable, in which the ice covers much of France and Germany, mm-hmm. all of Scandinavia. There's other times, different parts of the cycle, where it can be not as bad. It might be only Scandinavia, or there's other periods like today in which there's essentially no ice age at all. So all that's actually important background for what's going on at any given time in Europe. Now, for the time we're most interested in, which is since the birth of agriculture, that starts around when the ice is really pulling back. It's already pulled back quite a bit by the time farmers start moving into Europe.
And when is most
of the time, 10,000 years ago.
Okay.
9,000 years ago, something like that. The ice is really melting, really retreating. I think there was still some in Scandinavia at this point. That was where it lasted the longest. Anyhow, there were things that happened in between modern humans moving to Europe and the beginning of our main story, and they sometimes involved one group of hunter-gatherers replacing another. That happened more than once. It wasn't just modern humans replacing Neanderthals. Other groups replaced each other. We know this happened in ancient times, even among hunter-gatherers. But the main part of our story is about Europe since the beginning of agriculture.
Okay.
And of course it has happened again and again. But some people might say the exact same people who first settled Europe after the Neanderthals, they're still like most Europeans are descended from them. The answer is no. I said, well, are they descended mostly from the second group that moved in? No. Although you might find a trace. Are they descended mostly from the third group that moved in? No. There's been a lot of turnover.
Okay. So, and the people who were there originally, almost all of them died out. The men and women did not succeed in having children that have survived to this time.
We don't see, I mean, the answer is somewhere between very low and zero ancestry in modern Europeans from that group. Okay. Not a lot. And by the way, there are several ways. I mean, like, for one thing that happened is in between 45,000 years and now, there was a time called the glacial maximum, where the world was in fact quite cold, and probably only small parts of Europe were even habitable. Europe is pretty far north. I mean, that meant people were living in places like Spain and southern Italy and Greece. And in northern Europe, maybe nobody was living there. So that's one way for a group to be eradicated. Sometimes it may well be somebody comes in and pushes you out, but it could also be that you're just at a place where the climate turns bad, and it's just not possible to make a living. Mm-hmm. We don't know the details of this. And it's hard to see how we're going to. It's a long time ago. But we do see repeated change.
Okay. And do we know if it was someone from outside Europe coming in, or might it have been one subgroup in Europe just taking over?
In different phases, I think you see some of each.
Okay.
Although the only thing you can say, you see very early as modern humans moved out of Africa, cross your fingers because we're not absolutely sure there wasn't an earlier stage either than this, although it can't be hugely significant. But one of the very early things that happened was kind of a split between East and West in Eurasia. Mm-hmm. Okay? And I can say that for the most part, the groups that were replacing each other in Europe, some of them had probably held out in part of Europe. Some of them came from outside, but they didn't, as far as we know, except for a very minor extent, come all the way from China. You can even a long time ago, you can tell at least the eastern branch or the western branch of people in Eurasia, mm-hmm. Which probably boils down to geography. Things like the Himalaya mountains really, it's not utterly impossible to get to the other side, but it's so hard. There's not a lot of traffic back and forth and groups start to drift apart.
Yeah, it'd be hard to bring an army.
Well, armies hadn't been invented for most of this time, but you can sometimes see traces of Eastern ancestry in some of these early groups in Europe, but mostly it's like different groups in Western Eurasia are pushing each other around. Which is only because, if nothing else, because they're closer to each other. Mm-hmm. And during this period, we didn't see any new groups move up there from Africa, as far as I know. We keep finding things out here. So, like anything I say, it's always possible that we'll find out. The things I may say may have happened, but we may have missed certain other things that changed the story.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But the beginning of our main story is probably when farmers start moving into Europe, I think.
Okay. Where did the farmers come from?
Most of them seem to have come from what is now Turkey.
Okay.
The place where agriculture was invented is the Fertile Crescent. Basically places where you can raise things on rain rather than more sophisticated things like irrigation was not really invented at the very first stage. Mm-hmm. So you have mountains in southern Turkey and northern Syria, and also mountains in the eastern edge of Iraq and on the western edge of Iran. Mm-hmm. Those areas are apparently where agriculture was first invented. Even there, it may have been sort of simultaneous, with slightly different flavors to it in different parts of this region. So, and by the way, agriculture was independently invented later in other places, but some place had to be first. And as far as we can tell, northern Middle East is the first place. Okay. So people developed a suite of crops that many of which are still used today. Some of which we use more complicated variants than we did then, but things like wheat, barley, certain things like lentils, things like some of the a few things, so the first domesticated animals other than the dog, people domesticated cows, people domesticated goats, people domesticated sheep.
Have they domesticated horses yet?
That comes a bit later.
Okay.
So, you might, a lot of this stuff, there's kind of a package of early things that the first farmers in the Middle East had going. And the things I said that's most of the package. And there were, for a while there were kind of different regional flavors, but these guys weren't incredibly far apart, and, different domesticates got exchanged until people in a wide belt are sort of have access to this whole package of something like 7 crops and 3 domesticated animals, something like that. Cows, sheep. Sheep were different back then. They weren't woolly. It was more like hair on them. It was not something you could easily make into clothes.
So you were eating the meat.
Yeah. They might have milked them some too. So they had cows. They had, like in the Zagros Mountains in eastern, on the border of Iran and Iraq, which is where part of this was happening. That's apparently where the goat was domesticated. People there, before they picked up the whole package, they were probably first goat herders. Mm-hmm. Some of the places where, the exact, you have hints because you look at wild ancestors of these plants. You figure whoever domesticated the plant, it comes from a region where the plant actually grew, which are those regions, they're limited. They're not every possible place. So you know something about where things originated. And then you have archaeology when you start finding evidence of these things. So places like northern Syria, southern Turkey, that's where wheat was first grown. And by the way, if I was wrong, it was actually 200 miles in some other direction, that could happen. But it's in that general vicinity. So some of these things we know.
Okay, so these first farmers, they had a set of tools, and they were able to get a lot more calories per acre.
Yes, their numbers. You tend to support a lot more people. Now, by the way, this probably improved with time as they developed more things to grow and so forth. Here's an example. Suppose at first you had a group that was living a very large part of their diet was wheat. Mm-hmm. It turns out there's a particular vitamin-like substance that you don't find much of it in wheat. So you could end up with a shortage of that if you're mainly living on wheat. Mm-hmm. It's a thing called ergothioneine, which you can get in a health store. It's not vitamin pills because as yet nobody knows what it does. However, it turns out there's a particular molecule that's a transporter for this. It helps grab it in digestion. And among these very early wheat farmers, a variant of this that was better at holding on to ergothioneine became quite common. Mm-hmm. So you see this, for example, in some of it's like maybe 40% of their descendants today will have a copy of this version that is better at holding on to ergothioneine. But it probably doesn't matter as much as it used to because, for some time people have had more choices than just wheat.
Right.
But it was long enough that it became fairly common in places like Southern Europe, which was largely settled from people in this vicinity. So already, people are starting to change. I mean, I'm sure they changed in many ways because one thing that happens besides having more people is you're not moving around all the time. You're more sedentary. You have to take care of a field. You have to keep, animals you have to protect your fields, and kill weeds, harvest it, plant it. You tend not to move around as much. You also have something to lose. I mean, for example, suppose you have storage bins and they're full of grain. Somebody could steal it. In the past, it was harder to just steal stuff. There wasn't that much portable wealth. Some people think the beginnings of governments has to do with having stored, easily stealable stuff.
Yeah, you need to organize to have a protection service.
Only because of all the other thieves.
Well,
but
yeah,
yes. So, the thieves locally say, well, you need to listen to us to protect you from the other thieves. Well. This is called a government. Though it can eventually acquire other functions as well. Like one interesting example is there are people, some kinds of crops tend to be grown. They may last in the ground. Let's say something like sweet potatoes, but they don't store very well in a bin. Mm-hmm. It's hard to tax those people.
Yeah, you can't see what they have.
And some places that depended more on root crops didn't end up with much of a government. Places like New Guinea, mm-hmm. where they're growing taro and other things. And this may have been a factor in parts of sub-Saharan Africa too. Like in a sense, grain fuels the state. But any rate, so these guys were farming and their numbers expanded. They started, one interesting thing, by the way, is that if you look along the west, the east coast of the Mediterranean, places in Turkey and what's Israel, Lebanon and so forth, there were people there. They weren't too different from each other, perhaps because there weren't huge geographical barriers between each other. Mm-hmm. And even though they weren't incredibly far away, the people in the eastern area, in the Iranian area, were genetically kind of different. They probably looked fairly different. Now today, those groups are sort of thoroughly mixed all over the Middle East, mm-hmm. but back then they weren't, even though they weren't incredibly far apart. That's sort of a general fact about the late Ice Age. Groups that weren't too far apart could be genetically quite different. Mm-hmm. I don't think we understand exactly why. Some of it may have been like part of it is like not long before the end of the Ice Age was one of the most intense parts of the Ice Age, the glacial maximum, and the world was kind of a difficult place. There were a lot of deserts and things that may have acted as geographical barriers between populations. The fraction of the world that was very easy to live in was a lot smaller than it is now. Mm-hmm. Any rate, so we have these early farmers. We have the Western farmers in the Middle East, and you have the Eastern farmers. Although after a while, they've kind of shared their crops. Mm-hmm. They're using both. And what they do, which is, and this is interesting because many people have invoked this as a model, for example, that might drive the spread of languages and other things. And they're right, but their timing was kind of wrong. I'm trying to think, who was the Renfrew was suggesting that, Europe had been populated by farmers out of the Middle East, and that's how the Indo-European languages spread. Mm-hmm. And it was populated by such people, but that's not how the Indo-European languages spread because they came later. So these guys first start, they may have first settled some of the Aegean islands, and then they got to Greece, mm-hmm. and then they were settling various areas in Greece. Some of them moving farther north. Some of them started moving along the coasts. So you had farmers with basically this toolkit. Some of them ended up going up the Danube once they got that far north.
And there already were humans living in these areas, right? They were hunter-gatherers?
Yes, there were hunter-gatherers that lived all through Europe who were genetically, again, fairly different from these guys from the Middle East. They didn't independently develop agriculture, although some of them may eventually adopted it. But mostly agriculture spread by Middle Eastern farmers spreading. So these Middle Eastern farmers, they had two basic routes. One was moving up the Danube. Mm-hmm. The other way was going along the northern coasts of the Mediterranean. So they started out in somewhere probably along the northwest Greek coast, somewhere in that vicinity. And then they moved over to Italy and settled parts of Italy. They settled Sicily. They settled Sardinia. Then they moved and they settled southern France. Then they moved along the coast of Spain and all around the coast of Spain. And eventually they ended up meeting the other branch somewhere in France. Mm-hmm. We know that some, like the branch that went up the Danube, kept a certain amount of contact for a long time with its roots. There was a particular kind of seashell in the Aegean that they did various things with, spondylus, mm-hmm. and they were trading it for all the way to the region which is now Paris for perhaps, I forget, 1,000 years or something. Although eventually they must have gotten bored with it. I mean, but so all of these groups, or almost all of them anyhow, there is some indication that they may have a separate group that may have been more like the Eastern Middle Easterners in the very far south of Greece, the Peloponnese. Mm-hmm. But generally, these people spread all over Europe. They mixed some with the previous hunter-gatherers, whose hunter-gatherers' basic way of living you might compare to Indians who didn't have agriculture, say Indians in Canada, or Indians a little before some of their crops were introduced that far north. I mean, like Indians in California didn't farm, so or Indians in the Pacific Northwest didn't farm. You might compare them to the sort of life that these hunter-gatherers lived in Europe. There was some mixing with the hunter-gatherers, but not, at least at first, a tremendous amount. The farmers spread all over Europe. And one of the interesting things is, you see, they are genetically fairly similar to a population that still exists today. It's essentially a population that was off in a corner somewhere. It got settled by these people, and then no really major population movements touched it ever again.
Oh, what place is that?
Sardinia. In particular, people who live up in the highlands of Sardinia. Mm-hmm.
So they survived the future waves of genocide and conquest.
Well, lots of people, they're not the only people survived, but they survived with being much less affected than anybody else. Mm-hmm. So, if you look at the genetics of ancient DNA from these early farmers, you will find early farmers in Germany. They look a lot like Sardinians genetically. You can find early farmers in France. They look like Sardinians. And you look at the ones that were in Greece, or Bulgaria. They look like Sardinians. There are people like this. By the way, they're also persisting hunter-gatherers. up in Scandinavia. But the farmers in Scandinavia look like Sardinians genetically. The population of England and Ireland, say 6,000 years ago, they're some of the last groups to be settled, the last areas to be settled. They look like Sardinians. Everybody, Europe had been covered with farmers, at least most of Europe. I'm not sure how far they got into places like Russia or the Baltic. And they look genetically, they have mixed some with the previous inhabitants, but not enormously. They're probably 90% what they started out as being, which is out of Turkey and the Middle East. By the way, simultaneously, farmers want to move to a place where there are no farmers. That's where there's open land. Yes. So there were farmers from the area of Israel, a little farther south, who were genetically not too different from the ones in Turkey, who were moving into Egypt and North Africa. And later, some of their descendants moved even further into Africa. But most of the ancestors of the peoples in North Africa and Egypt are from the Middle East in this wave. While as another group of people, the guys who were to the east, were moving east, farming places in Iran and India. So farmers were expanding in all directions. By the way, these other groups don't appear to have had the same languages as far as we know. And the eastern ones are genetically more distant from the eastern Middle Eastern types are genetically more distant from the western Middle Eastern types. So anyhow, let's say 6,000 years ago, Europe has farmers. Now those farmers don't farm in exactly the same way as modern people. They tend to specialize on certain kinds of easy to farm kinds of land, easy for their techniques. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of soil called loess soil, which is from drifting soil blowing in the wind. Mm-hmm. It tends to be fairly rich, and also it's fairly easy. Like you can imagine another soil, which is almost like, it's like clay, and it's thick, and it's actually sort of physically hard to push a plow through it or something. It's actually some of it quite good soil, but it's hard to do with the techniques they had back then. Thick black soil, like in the American South, you might call it gumbo. Mm-hmm. They didn't like to farm that kind of place, and I don't think they did it. They like sort of light soils, kind of where you can scratch a furrow fairly easily. And so they farmed in that kind of area typically, although I presume with time they must have somewhat expanded, what their methods would deal with. But because of this, and also for other reasons, I'm sure there's a million things people learned about farming in the days since these times. Their total numbers were not as high as they're nothing compared. They were a lot lower than today, and they were also a lot lower than, say, in classical times. In classical times, there might have been, more than 10 million people in France. Back in these days, let's say 6,000 years ago, there was a good deal less. I don't know, 2 million, I'm guessing.
And were the hunter-gatherers surviving in the land that wasn't good for farming?
Apparently, yes. And because one of the things that first seems strange is over the next couple of millennia, gradually the amount of hunter-gatherer ancestry we see in these farming groups is increasing. You can't have that happen unless the hunter-gatherers are still there. And in fact, we found some groups where the hunter-gatherers, you can see 2,000 years later, they were still there, and some of them hadn't mixed too much, but eventually they did mix. And there's probably also a certain combination of some hunter-gatherers picking up some of the techniques and perhaps becoming farmers themselves. But so by the time this finally settles down, maybe at this point the ancestry is only 70% Middle Eastern or 80, something like that. And there's now more now more hunter-gatherer ancestry than they had been. But eventually the hunter-gatherers are all absorbed or gone. Mm-hmm. Okay. But that is only the beginning. So, if we looked at Europe 6,000 years ago, and we have found DNA, like one famous example is, you've heard of the Iceman in northern Italy?
Yes, yeah.
A guy who, he was probably running from his enemies and bleeding to death, and he froze to death in a little area where he was completely covered by ice for the next several thousand years. Preserved enormous amounts of interesting information because his gear, his bow, his arrow, his copper axe, all sorts of gear he had, his clothing is preserved enough you can study it. That's very unusual. But by the way, he looked Sardinian. They all looked Sardinian. Oh, And like one of the funny things about this, there are a couple of different ways to measure genetic closeness, but at least one of them, even as I said, people in North Africa had largely been settled from the Middle East. If you look at ancient Egyptians, and we have some DNA from them in a few cases. The living group they look closest to is again Sardinians, simply because modern Egyptians have mixed more with other different groups, and that hadn't happened quite as much 2,000 years ago. So in Roman days, but another thing that this means is that we'll get to it in a minute. But see, most of all of Europe was settled by these people from the Middle East, or almost all of Europe. Maybe not Finland. But they and most of Southern Europe, that's still where most of their ancestry. See, Sardinia, it's almost all of their ancestry is from this group. But in places like Italy or Greece or Spain, most of it is still from these early farmers. But one of the things that meant was that, Romans, for example, were simply genetically not incredibly different from Egyptians. And they're still not. They're more different than they were because there's been a lot of African admixture, or some anyhow, in Egypt over the past couple of 1,500 years. But some of in a sense, you could say the whole Roman Empire, except for a couple places they didn't conquer very much, except for say England, and Germany, was genetically kind of similar. I don't know if that mattered any for running the Roman Empire, but it was true. And if somebody said, this guy's from Egypt, but he doesn't look, he could maybe pass for Italian, which some of them could, said that's because they weren't really all that different.
Okay.
Which is interesting. Anyway, but this is, so these farmer people, we know a lot about them, but there's all sorts of things we wish we knew. We have their artifacts. We know what sort of houses they built. We know what sort of crops they raised. We probably have at least a vague idea as to how dense their population was. Again, not super dense compared to more modern things. And in some cases like that we could look at how did people in the Iceman's day do things. We know something about how they made their clothes. We know about things they used. There's a type of fungus that's called, you use as tinder when you're striking a spark. People still used it in Europe until very recently. That's what he used. We know he had tattoos. We know a lot about him. We know what he had in his last meal. We know, what killed him, etc. But one thing we don't know, and people are interested, is how did these people think? And, there's no written records. So we don't really know.
You think there's a chance they thought very differently than we do?
I wouldn't be surprised if they thought at least some differently. Let's say different enough to be interesting. But, we know certain things. They have certain skills we know about. Like when they first show up, they don't have metallurgy. They're not using metals. But they develop skills basically in using copper. And they may have been the first people in the world to use it. It's hard to say. The earliest examples in southeastern Europe are pretty similar in time to the earliest examples we have from the Middle East. It could be either of them, or it could be independent. But people actually used copper more in Neolithic Europe, apparently because there was more. There's a lot of good copper deposits in the Balkans, and so people made a lot of things out of copper. We found places where people mined copper and so forth. We know there's certain things that don't show up. Like we don't see obvious signs of huge hierarchy. Like we don't see palaces and we don't see huge temples. Does that mean this? Yeah. Well, we just don't. Now some people have gone way off the deep end and imputed all kinds of interesting things, some of which could even be true, but the point is no one can tell. There was a woman, anthropologist, who got many things right, by the way, talking about early Europe and the transition to Indo-European languages. Gimbutas, originally Lithuanian. But she said, well, the ancient, the early Neolithic populations of Europe, And by the way, we also knew a little bit about even before DNA, we knew something about their skeletons and stuff, which is basically, they're a little shorter. They're not big people. Not midgets or anything, but, we're talking 3-4 inches different from, say, Northern Europe today, and the later people who came to Northern Europe. But she talked about them as being, a place where women were honored and not patriarchal, there's weak evidence for a couple of these things. And that, they were probably peaceful. I said, well, maybe not, actually. We have evidence they fought a lot with during the periods they were still coexisting or pushing into territory with the hunter-gatherers. There's good reason to think they fought each other, kind of like pioneers and Indians.
Yeah, the hunter-gatherers must not have been thrilled with a bunch of newcomers coming in. Yeah.
You think? Although at the same time, I could imagine some hunter-gatherers said, well, I will ally with these guys because there's somebody else who's a greater threat, or was there trade back and forth? I'm sure there was some. But I also know there were cases in which people were looking at one of these early agricultural settlements and saying, why are all these skulls piled up in this corner that look like hunter-gatherer skulls? Or there's an interesting book called War Before Civilization. A guy named Keeley is pointing out that the idea that everything was peaceful in the cases where we have no information that's based on nothing, of course. And by the way, we do have some information, and it all looks pretty bloody. So, for example, there was a time in which these farmers were moving into far Western Europe. It was their frontier. Mm-hmm. And they built things that looked like log stockades.
Defensive structures?
You might think so, but when Keeley was doing some archaeology in Belgium on this, everybody's saying, well, no, these are symbolic of exclusion between the wilderness and the territory of control and blah, blah, blah. They finally found one. There was also a ditch around the outside and it was full of dead people with arrows in their heads. They have found other ones like that. And people come up with just comical explanations. People who didn't want to believe these people fought like everyone else on Earth does. They would say, well, there was some symbolic thing where they took all the bodies and just spread them around the outside of this fort and left them there. Or in some cases where the fort had fallen, they left them on the inside too. Anyhow, they fought. I don't think that's all they did. And over the very long run, they kind of assimilated. Mm-hmm. But, the very long run is 2,000 or 3,000 years. But, they fought. And by the way, we also know that for various reasons we don't understand, I've talked about these little villages in Germany of the farming groups. Well, sometimes we would find a case where somebody, presumably from what tool hints we have, from another farming group, went over to this particular village and killed every single person in it.
So village disputes.
Something. Yeah. I don't know. People said, well, here are the only reasons. I said, well, if you look at history, that's at least a subset of everything that ever happened in history is at least possible.
How do you know it wasn't a hunter-gatherer group that did it rather than another village?
I think at the time this happened, it was kind of late for that. I'm not sure they still had signs they were still around. There's 2 or 3 of these, pretty well-matured villages just getting everybody slaughtered in them in Germany. If I remember the timings. By the way, it would not surprise me if in the early days there were some such conflicts with the hunter-gatherers, but these things didn't stop when the hunter-gatherers had pretty much disappeared as a separate group. Mm-hmm. So we know of 3 or 4 examples of this where, and of course, we haven't dug most of these things, but we know that occasionally they just go and wipe everybody out. Why? I said, I don't know. What are the reasons people do that? There are a number of reasons. You could say we wanted what they had. Or maybe they wanted what we had. Or maybe, they cooperated with a third force that wanted what we had. Or maybe they had habits that we just thought were really disgusting.
Well, isn't it likely
there's a million reasons. What?
Once there's no more frontier, then the population will increase faster than the food supply can. So.
Well, the point is there's never an infinite amount of stuff. Well, if the population was static, human wants can increase even if human needs don't. Yeah. Like it says, well, you could, for all I know, they're saying you obstructed our view of the mountains. I don't know why. Also, because these things can escalate, you can start out with a mild hostility and then after somebody acts on it, that hostility may grow in the other group. It may compound.
And this is probably a time.
Who knows?
This is probably a time when there weren't plagues that were a major check on population growth, right?
There were fewer. I wouldn't say zero. There are some things like we don't. That's a subfield. Like if we got enough skeletons, and then you had there's certain diseases at least that leave a mark on a skeleton, and that might actually get better because now we're getting to the point we could actually find DNA from pathogens sometimes.
Oh.
So that might be another route than just looking for bone damage. But I think I think these things were a smaller problem then, but not zero. There are problems that happen just because people, like if everybody lives in a given place and they poop near each other, there are certain diseases that are more common that are, things like worm infestations and stuff. Mm-hmm. Some of that is almost inevitable anytime you just get more crowded. Now, the other thing is over time, new diseases adapt to these concentrated human populations. Some of them get brought in from distant places with trade and so forth. And certainly most of that hadn't happened yet. There's diseases you can be fairly sure they didn't have, some of which because we know for sure they didn't show up till a particular year. Mm-hmm. But they had some things. And it's also possible that their immune systems were not as ready. So it's a balance. It's not just how many diseases you have. It's to what extent is your immune system up to it. I would imagine they had their problems. I don't know. I doubt if they were severe as the American Indians suddenly exposed to a vast number of all the diseases from Eurasia. That was an unusually serious crisis. But it would there were probably less things floating around. But I would also bet the average person was less resistant to a variety of things than they are today. So, it was another question is you can get to a situation, at least some things suggest, where you spend so much fighting that your setup gets messed up. If you look at the Mayan city-states, they spent all their time fighting, and it may have had something to do with some of the declines they had for a while after before the new Mayan empire, which was, like 500 years later, some of these groups became more vigorous again. But constant fighting could have bad consequences, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Did they fight constantly? We don't really know that. The artifacts we find, they're not as dominated by weapons as some later groups. Mm-hmm. But, they had them. They had to have them, if nothing else, for hunting deer. Mm-hmm. But if you can hunt deer, you can hunt people. Once in a while they did. Again, we don't know anything about what they were thinking. There's pieces of art that they have, some of which are actually quite appealing. Mm-hmm. Statues. There's one called the Thinker that I put on the I put a picture of that on the blog in the post I made about Europe. It's funny because it looks a whole lot like Brancusi. Mm-hmm. If you've ever,
I'm not familiar with that. No.
Yeah. Well, my real question is whether Brancusi was familiar with this. By the way, it's an interesting
cultural appropriation from the first farmer. So
I don't see anything wrong with being inspired by something interesting at all. But anyhow, we know something about the skills they had. We don't know. We're not aware of any writing system they had. If they did, it's not. By the way, there actually are some things that have a certain set of symbols which you see occasionally in the Balkans. Nobody knows what they mean, or if it was it's kind of unlikely it was a real writing system. They're kind of other intermediate things which are just more like, things like stop signs or dangerous curves ahead. They mean something, but they're not really part of a complete, you can't represent the whole language with them. Mm-hmm. Pictograms, they may have had some Vinca script. Does it mean anything? Nobody knows.
Okay.
This is all a long time ago. There are a lot of good sites to dig and find it. We have found, we can find skeletons, we can find evidence, but part of the problem is their culture kind of got stepped on by a later culture, and it's hard to know what they thought because we don't really know how much or if any of their culture survived.
So what was the group that stepped on them, and when did that happen?
Okay, well, this is another interesting thing, particularly the way it interrelates with, the development of archaeology and archaeological thinking and so forth. You see, Most people in Europe today speak an Indo-European language. There are only a couple of exceptions, 3. There's some Finnish and a couple of languages related to Finnish. Estonian, which is real close, and Hungarian, which is, medium close. And the other one, which is a language isolate, no known living relatives, is Basque, up in northern Spain and a little bit in the corner of France. That's it. That's the languages people speak in Europe. And all the other languages are related. You can see resemblances, in simple things like, basic words, and sometimes more than basic words. Like as we know that several languages descend from Latin. This is one where we know the details historically. We have French, we have Spanish and Portuguese, we have Romanian, we have Italian, we have Romansh in central Switzerland. Okay, we know all of them are descended from Latin, and we can see, but even if Latin did not exist, you could use this to deduce something that how Latin should have existed, because you look for the common features and things of that sort. Okay, well, it turns out, but at an earlier stage, there was a language which was the common ancestor of many languages, including Latin, including Greek, including the Germanic languages, including the Slavic languages, obviously all the things that descend from Latin, and some languages in Eastern areas such as Iranian and most of the languages of India. And this became, when a lot of people who did some traveling started noticing these resemblance. Some of it would just be, basic words like father, pater, vater, pitar in Sanskrit. There's just a lot of shared basic things. The numbers, you can identify the, commonalities in, numbers from 1 through 10. You can identify words for a lot of basic things. And this has turned into a whole discipline of its own, and one that's been very productive. Basically historical linguistics, which probably the most successful project they've done is trying to understand the origin of the Indo-European languages. In that post I put up a bunch of examples of the numerals in different things. It's just one example. I also threw one in one Indo-European language that didn't even exist, just to see if people were reading carefully.
Did anyone pick up on it?
Yes, they did, and they were actually rather pleased. It was a science fiction story in which, alternate universe in which Venus and Mars are habitable and even have humans or possible humans on them. And so we have some explorers who are talking with these possible humans on Venus. And then they realize that their words for their people and some basic words and words for the numerals all sound European, Indo-European, and they are. So I threw in this imagined Indo-European language just to see if anybody. And there's somebody said it's thrilled. I've been looking for a new Indo-European language for some time because I thought I knew them all. But anyway, so this is probably the bigger part of our story is the story of Indo-European languages and of Indo-Europeans.
Okay.
Which is as I said, all these people were speaking probably related languages. Now, not close anymore, because these guys took several thousand years to spread across Europe. That's time for languages to differ. But they it is also possible in a few places that the language of the previous hunter-gatherers persisted in some group. But I'll bet that in most areas, people were speaking languages in this big family of languages descended out of the people who moved out of Turkey, descended from whatever language they spoke when they moved to Greece.
Okay, and this is not an Indo-European language.
This is a pre-group.
Okay.
And the thing is, there might be one language which is a survivor. Basque might be a survivor.
Okay, from the first farmers or from the hunter-gatherers?
Well, actually, both are possible, but I bet on the farmers. Usually, when you have conflicts usually, not always, when you have some sort of conflict between the farmers and the hunter-gatherers, bet on the farmers winning. Yeah. But also dominating culturally and dominating, it's typical, like when, there there's only really one country in Latin America where people speak something other than Spanish or Portuguese to any really significant extent. All right, 2 or 3, but Spanish is dominant. Like the place where Spanish is least dominant is Paraguay, where people speak the local Guarani language. Quite a few people speak that. Maybe more than half the population speaks it. But, almost everywhere else, the imported language is the dominant one. Mm-hmm. I can find you people who speak Mayan, but there's a lot more people who speak Spanish, even in Mexico, probably even in Guatemala. So, anyhow, my guess is if it is. And the other thing is there may have been other languages that survived up to the dawn of history that they were certainly ones that weren't Indo-European, and some of them may also have been in this, my projected Anatolian family.
Okay.
Early farmer family.
First farmers, yeah.
So we had, there was Etruscan.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are reasonably sure it's not Indo-European, but that's about all we know. And the thing is, that's another one of these interesting things that almost works. Like we know that a particular emperor wrote a dictionary of Etruscan, but we don't have any copies of it. But we have some inscriptions. We even have at least one book, I think, written in Etruscan, but nobody can read it. They can read a few words, but, obvious things like somebody's name or something. Mm-hmm. But we can't. But the thing is, it's on this list. Like, if somebody found a copy of, I think it was Claudius that did this. I may be wrong. Anyhow, suppose we found a copy of that book. Everything would change. We'd know an enormous amount about Etruscan. We could probably read all or most of the inscriptions. And then all these questions about what, if anything, is it related to or where did it come from? We'd have a real good, but, it all depends on luck. And similarly, there were languages which we think were related to Basque that used to be more widely spread in Spain. This is some of us judging from place names and things. Mm-hmm. And there is a guy who's considered generally crazy, although I don't think he's quite as crazy as people thought, a guy named Theo Veneman, who thought that a lot of Western Europe was occupied by people once upon a time speaking languages related to Basque. He, again, looking at very old place names and things, river names and stuff, he could be right. It is for sure true that, say, 6,000 years ago, everybody in Western Europe was speaking a set of languages that probably weren't Indo-European. They were probably related languages. And Basque might be one of their descendants. Veneman might be right. Mm-hmm. At least, or part of what he's saying might be right.
Okay.
There's several classes of crazy people that have been validated by some of this recent work. But maybe they never were crazy. Maybe everybody else was crazy.
There's the obvious joke about you and the Neanderthals interbreeding with humans.
We weren't the only person who thought that. It was at the time we were talking about it. I was sure it was likely because I had looked at, again, how separated groups had to be before breeding became difficult. Mm-hmm. And I said, you're running each other. If nothing else, there should be some rape. Yeah. And also I said at least some of it should show up as useful because they were in places like Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, so likely they had some useful adaptations. Mm-hmm. Okay, now that was all pretty logical. It didn't mean it was 100% certain. I'd say only 90% plus. Most people in human genetics thought it unlikely. They had a couple of weak reasons and one stronger but not good reason. One reason is, like, we had looked and it was clear that nobody had any Neanderthal Y chromosomes. Mm-hmm. But all that would necessarily mean is their Y chromosome didn't fit very well. Similarly, they didn't have any Neanderthal mitochondria. But again, same argument. It's just saying, that's like saying one particular gene from the Neanderthals didn't work. Mm. Okay. But the other reason, which was the strong one, that it really influenced people, was they thought it because everybody else thought it. Oh. That's it. Those are all the arguments there were. Or plus occasionally nobody would have done such a thing, which I thought was genuinely hilarious.
Yeah. But let's go back. So the people who spoke the Indo-European, they ended up conquering the first farmers. They ended up conquering. That's
what it looks like. Like, first, what we know is there was a culture that lived on the plains of Russia.
Okay.
And this
where are the, like, right now, where are the plains of, is that like what part of
Southern
Russia?
Southern Russia.
Southern Russia.
Places like areas just north of the Caucasus, areas east of there to some extent. The Ukraine is part of this region. Areas that were historically grasslands.
Right.
And we know that there was a culture that probably started out around the southern edge of this region. That some new techniques happened. People put the pieces together. It was now easy. You could make a good living out on these plains. Previously, it was kind of difficult.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was the wheel, so you could go around in wagons. See, the fundamental problem is most of this area, though it rains enough for plenty of grass, it's a lot like the American Great Plains. It's hard to farm there, but grass grows. If you were raising cattle or something and could find a way to herd them efficiently, also sheep, you could make a good living there.
Okay.
We're talking cowboys.
So
okay.
they can't earn a living farming, but they can raising animals.
In most of the area, at least with the methods they had, farming was probably limited to near some of the rivers.
Right.
And some of the people, and their farming wasn't all that widespread in this region. So yeah, but cattle do well there. Mm-hmm. But to do cattle, you needed basically two things. One of them was you need a wagon, and the invention of the wheel around 4000 BC, which may have even been in this region. Nobody knows. Wheels are found early in a number of regions, but you see, they spread rapidly. Whoever invented the wheel, people said, this is, when people saw the wheel, their reaction was, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And so wheels spread rapidly. We know wheels early in the Middle East. I don't know where it was invented.
Why do you need a wagon to raise animals?
You need to be moving around. You're going from region to region. The cattle are going where the grass is, which they use it up in a given area. They got to move somewhere else. Particularly, you have a lot of cattle, which you would like to have. You need to be able to visit water sources. Now, there was one point in which David Reich was saying, well, with these wagons, by the way, the original wagons are probably first pulled by oxen. Mm-hmm. Later, the next ingredient, which really helps you herd the animals and makes this whole thing really work, is probably domesticating the horse. Okay, but David Reich in his book was saying, well, and also you could get further away from water sources. You could carry water in your wagon, for your cattle. And the answer is, actually you can't. They drink too much. Like an average number of gallons per day for a cow is like 12.
Yeah, they probably didn't have watertight storage containers, or at least.
Well, you would need pretty good ones, and they'd have to be light and not fall apart. Like, they probably had water skins. There's no sign these guys had, big pottery jars. I don't know how they could have carried a lot of water. The other thing is it's so heavy. Like, what it means is, or I'm thinking, when I read about guys doing cattle drives, mm-hmm. or people on the Oregon Trail, or Mongols, or anybody, who are pastoralists who raise cattle, never have I heard about them carrying all the water in the back of the wagon, because they don't. What they do is they know where the water sources are. They are willing to get a little bit past them. I mean, like your cows might be able to go for an extra day without it, but you go to a place there's going to be water, and even in most of these places, there's enough to have some of this kind of cattle raising and sheep raising. I mean, people manage. But those water sources, they can be limited, they can be valuable, and people can fight over them. But they don't just carry it all in a big, or today people will they'll actually have a big container and they'll put the water out, even if there's no water nearby, mm-hmm. In a cattle ranch. But they carry something that's pulled about the size of a semi to bring enough water to last for a reasonable amount of time. Anyhow, all this reveals is that David Reich did not grow up on a cattle ranch, but that's okay.
So you mentioned it before. So David Reich is a professor at Harvard, and he's he's probably the leading person in looking at ancient DNA.
Yes, and another person who I probably should have mentioned specifically is who is possibly his right arm or his right brain is a guy named Nick Patterson.
Okay.
See, a lot of this work has depended on developing certain methods of analyzing DNA, particularly methods that are not too sensitive to the fact that ancient DNA is sometimes kind of crappy. There are chemical changes happen in ancient DNA. You could think of it as noise, errors, confusion. You need to find sophisticated methods that deal with large amounts of data, tell you what you want to know, that also are insensitive to the noise. Like, for example, the Neanderthal samples we get weren't exactly as good as one you'd get in the clinic. Mm-hmm. It's been a little while. So that was a guy named Nick Patterson. And Nick Patterson, like when you get down to the real data processing details, and Nick Patterson is, I'm told, knows everything. Now that probably can't be true forever as they hire more people and do more work in the area, but he's, the guy in terms of, doing a lot of coming up with the analysis tools.
Okay.
Reich, I think, is generally familiar with these things and is a part of this story, but he's the administrator, and that must take some of his time, where I think that Patterson is really careful never to get into anything like that. Patterson is an interesting guy. He's smart. By education, he's a mathematician. At one point, when he's young, he was Irish youth. He's from England, but he played an Irish chess tournament and won. Which means he's good. Doesn't mean he's world championship level, but he was damn good. He was a code breaker. He used to work at GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA.
Oh.
Later he worked at a place called IDA, Institute for Defense Analysis. They also do some code breaking, among other things. I interviewed with them once upon a time. Later he worked for Renaissance, which is considered the primo hedge fund of all of them. Mm-hmm. And then he got into this. And he's been very insightful. He came up. Now, some of these methods already existed, but nobody had used them much, or they didn't realize all their advantages. Other things he invented. But, methods of looking for things like, that can determine shared ancestry between groups and things. He did a lot of developments in that. He's been real important in all this work.
Well, now, how much trust can we have in this? I mean, there's, a lot of replication problems in various disciplines.
Well, other people have generally, not perfect, but generally, the digital data is available to other people. And, now other people, they often use standard programs to analyze them, but there are people who have also written their own variants to do the same thing. I don't know of any real problems in terms of, I don't think people are too unsure about the analysis for most of this stuff.
Okay.
I will tell a story from one of the other things these finds got, not part of this current talk much, but when they found the cousins of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans in Eastern Asia, and they were from a tiny sample with great DNA preservation. It's only part of a fingertip, but it's got great DNA. So we know enormous amounts of their genes, and all we know is they've got fingertips, and I think teeth. I mean, for all we know, that they didn't even have legs. And we also found out there were populations such as the Australian Aborigines and people in New Guinea who have some ancestry from this different group.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you a story which was fun. They came out with the original Neanderthal paper in 2010. John Hawkes and I had written some things about how we thought Neanderthal mixture was almost inevitable, and some of it would turn out to be useful and have spread in people.
Mm-hmm.
And we heard about this a little before the paper because there was a American Physical Anthropology conference in Albuquerque, virtually the only type of conference I ever bothered to go to, one that I can fall out of bed and be there. And there were people there who had been reviewing the Neanderthal paper. They knew what was coming, in about a week. We heard about it, and we tried not to be insufferable. I hope we succeeded, but it was fun. But later that summer, I was reading that paper in great detail. Wanted to understand what the tools they'd used and stuff. And I found something interesting. One of the consequences, of this finding is, as I said, it happened early, the Neanderthal mixture. So essentially everybody outside of Africa has it, and approximately the same amount, not a whole lot of difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you take a group in Africa, particularly one that split off very early, the genetic distance between them and everybody outside of Africa is essentially the same.
Okay.
They don't have anything, there's been no encounters since they split. And so, here's a group that split, and then it has all these descendants. They're all equally different from Bushmen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's almost true. Like the French are just as and by the way, since the split was so early, even other Africans are closer to people in Eurasia than the Bushmen are. I mean, in fact, they're closer than they are to the Bushmen. Your typical guy in Nigeria is closer to somebody in France than he is to a Bushman. Bushmen split off a long time ago. Okay, anyhow, but I was looking at these numbers, and they had these for a few. Again, these were not as abundant as today. People didn't do sequencing a genome was a major piece of work rather than something you do over the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
But they had some, and I said, so this French guy is just as far from the Bushman as this Chinese guy. I said, well, that's what should be. And we had some other examples. I said, but here's something funny. Deep in these tables on the online supplement, the people in New Guinea are farther away, and they're the only ones that are farther away.
So how did that happen? How could that have happened?
Not only that, the caption is wrong. So unless you look at the number and ignore the caption, you won't even know that they're farther away. Which I think was just a coincidence, by the way. I said there's only one way to get farther genetically away from the human, from an early human group. You have to mix with some other people who split off even earlier. In other words, you had to split with some archaic group like Neanderthals. But not Neanderthals, because these guys don't show a special level of Neanderthal admixture. I said, these guys mixed with someone else. And this is at the time, the only someone else we had as a candidate was the Denisovan sample.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote a little note to Nick Patterson saying, so, looks like people in New Guinea must have mixed with Denisovans. And he sent me a very polite note saying, we have a paper coming out in a couple of months. Much will be explained. But, there's a certain value in looking at the details of these things because, sometimes the thing they're about to tell you in the next paper is already there if you look in great detail. But at any rate, back to the Indo-Europeans.
Yes. So,
all right, we know that this culture expanded. First, we knew it archaeologically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, people knew that a long time ago. And it spread rapidly because once they had a method that worked on these grasslands where not many people had been living. And again, I think the horse is a very important part along with, wheels and wagons.
Mm-hmm.
They spread rapidly over. You see, the horse is important because it lets you ride and keep up and manage your cattle.
Now, when did they start to spread?
This is probably it's around the time I said that almost all of Europe has been covered with Middle Eastern farmers. Perhaps around 4,000 BC, perhaps 6,000 years ago, This culture is forming in these grasslands of southern Russia.
Okay. Is there a name for this group?
People usually call it the Yamnaya culture.
Okay.
There's also there's a group that may have been part of their ancestry just north of the Caucasus Mountains called the Maikop culture. But the main group is called the Yamnaya culture, and we know they spread very far.
Okay.
And then they start showing up in Europe.
Okay.
Now,
when did they start to show up in Europe?
Well, I think there's some signs of an earlier phase, but I'll talk about the big phase that we know the best.
Mm-hmm.
About 3000 BC, about 5,000 years ago.
Okay.
Over a fairly short period, there had been people who were who were Sardinian-like genetically, had this Middle Eastern package of farming, who were farming in places like, let's say, Germany and Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And then, maybe 100 or 200 years later, they're not. They're gone. Or rather, all their works are gone. There are no more buildings. There are no more villages. The only thing you can find are graves with guys, and by the way, the graves are somewhat different than the previous ones, and they're buried with a stone axe, which we used to call this the battle axe culture.
Mm-hmm.
And then it spreads. It spreads further east. It spreads up to at least the middle of Western Germany.
Mm-hmm.
It's in Scandinavia and the Baltics. And other groups that are probably related end up starting to spread in various parts of other parts of Europe, in Western Europe. Now, we now have some skeletons from those times. So we can say, the guys who are now in Germany and Poland, the battle axe culture, mm-hmm. they're genetically not the same as the previous farmers. They have some ancestry from those farmers, maybe 25%. And the rest looks like Yamnaya.
Okay.
The Yamnaya have moved in and mostly displaced the previous guys.
Were the Yamnaya farming when they reached Europe?
Somewhere between slim and none.
Okay.
I mean, some of this, they have a method of trying to figure out what people are up to that in principle can go beyond just the archaeology. They're studying the linguistics to see, are there early shared words for doing X? That means we did X. You know, like, is there a word for copper at the root of this branch of the Indo-European languages? The answer is yes. They knew about copper. Is there a word for wheels? Yes, there is. I mean, in some of those, the root is something like kuklos, which shows up in words like cycle today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so they attempt to figure out what sort of things they were up to from fossils in the language. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, and I don't think it always works, but I think it's a reasonable thing. And there are things that make it sound like they farmed, but the archaeology does not show much of it.
Okay.
And the other thing is the linguistics doesn't show a lot of it. And the third thing is it's beginning to look as if a lot of the words in the European language for various crops and things are actually not Indo-European at all. It looks as if they were picked up from the previous farming populations. So the word for peas, as apparently its root is a non-Indo-European word that must have been used by these previous people, the previous farming. The word for linen, as examples. So I think they were primarily stock raisers. I think they raised cattle and sheep and goats. And that's the main thing they did. I think they farmed a little, but not very much. And so we see changes. And those changes spread over Europe, genetic changes. So 6,000 years ago, the people in Ireland looked like kinda Sardinians genetically. 5,000 years ago, they looked like the modern Irish.
So the Yamnaya conquered. They must have had a lower population density. If you don't farm, you can't get as many calories.
They probably
per
did.
acre.
They probably did, although they might have farmed more acres because, as I said, the previous farmers seem to have been kind of specialized, and they only their farming methods only seemed to work or were only used in sort of a set of soils.
Okay.
Farming. There's also indications in some of these places that farming stopped even before the Indo-Europeans took over the place, and I don't think we know exactly why. I offer a suggestion, like in Ireland. People, like, you look at sediments in a pond, and for a while you're seeing, the sort of pollen you get from farming, from early European farming. Then it stops for a few hundred years, and then after a while everybody's into, these new groups which have a fair amount of ancestry from the Yamnaya are now the population.
So in between,
something happened. What I get, and the same thing happens in England. It looks like farming almost completely stopped in England for some time before the new people move in. By the way, we know, like in England, we know the extent of replacement. Like previously you had people who were sort of like Sardinians farming there. Then you go through a period of something where there's still some people there, but not very much farming. Then you have a new population in there. At first, they're not farming either, but they are raising cattle. The new population is very similar to English today. And it has some Yamnaya ancestry, maybe, 40% or something. And it has some, by the way, some hunter-gatherer ancestry, but it's not from the same hunter-gatherers who were there before. In other words, a mix happened somewhere roughly in Germany, and then they went and conquered England and wiped almost everybody out. But what happened to the farming in between? There's a few places where people kept doing it, and they're odd places, like the Orkney Islands. People were still farming in the Orkney, even that they'd stopped in England. Like I've heard people say, it was climate change. I said, yeah, you invoke that a lot, but there's no evidence for any real bad climate change in this period.
So what, it was either they were killed by some people or by disease?
I think it was something, the equivalent of piracy. Like imagine a period.
The Vikings. The equivalent of what the Vikings did?
Yes. I mean, imagine you have a bunch of guys and they're coming and they're attacking and there's nobody's stopping them. It's possible to get to the point where it's almost impossible to farm because you're not safe anywhere.
Yeah.
There have been cases like that in more recent history where certain kinds of guys who were, well, I mean, like, here's a simple example. There were areas of northern Mexico where people were farming. And then the Comanches got horses. And then, we'll call it the farming frontier, the farthest place north that people are regularly farming. Mm-hmm. It went backward for 100 years. Boy, because the Comanche would come and they would raid, nobody knew how to stop them. Yeah. And it wasn't because they were overwhelmingly numerous. It was more because they were mobile, aggressive, and also because they had the advantage of not having any homes. They just lived out permanently on the prairie.
Oh, so it's hard to retaliate.
Yeah, I mean, other kinds of Indians, even if they were difficult, like the Apaches farmed, they had homes. You could find them and retaliate against them. The Comanche were just out there. They were hard to find. Anyhow, so, in a case like that where you have raiders that you can't stop, it's perfectly possible that, less and less land gets farmed. Mm-hmm. There were times in the Middle Ages, in the early, the darkest of the Dark Ages, where you had all kinds of raiders and the population was dropping. And that meant there were places that people had farmed that they weren't farming.
So then, sort of from the point of the view of the raiders, it was like they were overfishing the population, where they raided so much that not enough.
Well, another way of saying is eventually they may have beaten down the locals so much that, we might as well invade. We're not getting that much anymore from them, and there aren't many left. Why don't we just take it? Yeah. Again, that's a guess. We don't know. But I can tell you things like that have happened repeatedly, where people on horseback or sea raiders have made life essentially impossible. I mean, now sometimes people solve the problem by developing their own state. Mm-hmm. Like Alfred the Great in England. He got the Anglo-Saxons better organized to the point where they could beat the Vikings. Yeah. But lots of times, there were places just like 800, 900 AD. Western Europe had trouble coming from all directions. There was some area in eastern France that in one generation they got raided by the Vikings who came up the rivers, the Magyars who were riding horses from the Hungarian plain, and the Muslims who were raiding from the southern French coast. And, Western Europe was kind of life wasn't easy during this period. I mean, like you lived on the coast, you had to worry about being killed, kidnapped, all your stuff being stolen, or if you're near a major river, or if you're someplace where Hungarians could ride. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were people who moved up into basically kind of crummy places in the hills, largely as just protection. I mean, particularly if you were near the coast somewhere, you had to worry about this a lot. At any rate, I don't know. And of course, one thing people say is, well, what's the archaeological evidence of this? I said, I don't think there is any. But, there might not be much if you just have a few raiders occasionally visited and burning something down. I mean, the clearest archaeological evidence is you burn down the city, then you build it anew your way, completely different architecture or something. Mm-hmm. I mean, like even burning down a city. Cities burn down by themselves sometimes. They didn't have fire departments. I mean, fire was a real threat to, unless you had a city where things are built out of, say, stone or something. But, it was always a threat.
Well, the absence of fire, if the archaeological evidence really shows there was no farming for a while, that's something awful must have happened. There was certainly not very much. And there's some similar indications in parts of Western Europe. Like the population crashed, and I think before the full settlement of the new guys, and I'm guessing it involved raiding, since guys on horseback versus other people who are sedentary, it's a common pattern. Now, were these the same kind of horses that we have? Were they as big or?
They're probably a bit smaller, but even a small horse is not impossible to ride.
And do we know what kind of weapons were they? Were they shooting arrows? Were they?
They probably had arrows. Arrows were known in this whole time. Like the original hunter-gatherers knew how to make arrows. Now swords, probably not quite, because at least in the first years we're talking about, which is about 5,000 years ago, about 3,000 BC, which is when this Yamna expansion seems to have really got going. By the way, there may have been a bit more earlier into places like Greece. But, the one which, by the way, we look at ancient times in Greece, one way you can start to tell what's going on is you have Mycenaean civilization, which is on the order of 1600 BC. We know they spoke Greek. We can read some of their records, Linear B. Okay. And recently we have looked at some ancient DNA from these times. On the mainland, they had about 15%, Yamnaya type ancestry. So the Yamnaya had an effect, but whatever happened there is probably closer to conquering people rather than mostly wiping them out and replacing them. There's degrees of these things. So 15% sounds like a bunch of guys who come in and conquer the place and then intermarry. Mm-hmm. By the way, they also got some DNA from from the civilization on Crete, the Minoans. Mm-hmm. And they did not have this steppe ancestry. No. So, by the way, another thing which might, if we ever get lucky and get the right clue, Minoan, we had this different, not an alphabet, a different symbol set that was used to write early Greek. But the Minoans probably didn't speak Greek. They didn't have Greek is an Indo-European language. Probably all of these things seem to have come off the steppe, or at least almost all of them. Mm-hmm. And the Minoans probably did not speak an Indo-European language, since also they had no steppe ancestry at the same time. Mm-hmm. But they also we have things written in Linear A. We just can't read it. Again, almost. Mm-hmm. And again, suppose we found something where we had, the equivalent of a Rosetta Stone, all of a sudden, we might know something about, like I said, we know art. We know some of the things they built, and we know some of the things that these early farmers didn't build. They don't seem to have castles, and they don't seem to have huge temples. But we don't know how they thought. We have weak indications. I was saying Gimbutas was sure she knew how they thought, but she was dreaming.
Well, did the Yamnami, did they build things?
No, for a long time they didn't build anything at all, so that's actually quite characteristic. Later they eventually came to, but originally, as I said, like in Germany, you can't find, for a few hundred years after they show up, you don't find anything at all. You find graves. You find almost no buildings, no villages. I think they were just raising cattle. Maybe a few guys once, if they'd farmed at all, I figure it was barley. Because they probably discovered beer by this time. And my picture of these guys, besides running around conquering people and bashing their heads in, also involves heavy drinking. But I don't actually know that. Although, for all I know, we'll dig somebody up and we'll be able to tell somehow. I don't know. Interesting things are possible.
Well, I bet we could tell with evolutionary adaptation, right? Because if you're constantly getting drunk.
Well, that's actually an argument against it, because we now know the people who've been farming for various means of times, almost anything you farm has carbohydrates in it and could be made into an alcoholic drink. Rice wine, barley for beer. You can make things out of corn. Everybody's done it. Okay. But alcohol, drinking alcoholic beverages is something that can cause trouble.
Yes.
Although it actually has some pluses as well, because, for example, if you drink something like wine, what if the practical reasons the Roman legions would prefer to drink wine? It said because you won't get dysentery if you drink wine. Mm-hmm. You won't pick there's enough alcohol in it, you kill the germs. Yeah. It doesn't take a lot, but that's a useful thing. On the other hand, what about becoming a drunk? That's a risk. So in essentially every population that's been farming a long time, and to some extent this depends on how long they've been farming, there have been adaptations that make you less likely to be an alcoholic. Not zero likely, but less likely. Mm-hmm. So if you have a population that's never farmed, is farmed for like a short time, like 1,000 years, every one of them has real problems with alcoholism. So Eskimos have problems with alcoholism. Navajo, they farm, but not for very long. They have trouble. Mm-hmm. Australian Aborigines have trouble. And interestingly enough, people with lots of Indo-European descent have more trouble than people with small or zero amounts.
Oh, so the first farmers had some adaptation.
They've been farming longer.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been farming as long as anybody on Earth.
So do Sardinians have a very low rate of alcoholism?
Well, the general way to look at it, I think, I don't know about Sardinians. I mean, they're so broke they might not even be able to afford it. But Southern Europe is mostly descended from those farmers. There is some Indo-European Yamnaya ancestry, particularly in the Y chromosomes, which makes you again wonder. But most, like the average Italian, like the average Greek is probably 75% Southern, southern end of the old farmers by ancestry. Italians varies according to how far north in Italy you are, but something in that ballpark. Southern France, kind of similar. Spain, kind of similar. They all have, other than Sardinians, they all have at least some of the steppe ancestry, but none of them is it as much as half. Mm-hmm. Whereas in places like, probably the highest place I know is probably someplace like Norway, which probably gives you a hint as what these Yamnaya women looked like 5,000 years ago. By the way, that's an alternate scenario for how they conquered, but I don't actually believe it. But it was like the Swedish bikini team invaded or something. I don't think that's what happened. But Northern Europeans, and one of the interesting things, you look genetically. Look at these FST numbers, a simple measure of how different people are. You go all the way from Russia, or at least Poland, all the way to say Scotland or Ireland. People aren't all very genetically different. This has actually always been a clue sitting around. Why are they so similar across this whole region? Mm-hmm. I said because they have a recent common origin.
Yeah,
without. Not exactly the same, because it somewhat depends how much you mixed with the previous inhabitants, but it's not a whole lot. One thing, a lot of places, they didn't mix much. Like in England, they used to have these people who were kind of Sardinian-like with some hunter-gatherer mixture. Mm-hmm. They're the guys who built Stonehenge. Okay, then they were gone. And today, the amount of ancestry that the British have from that group is like maximum 7%. Mm-hmm. The other guys replaced them. And they replaced them in Ireland. Now, some of the areas, like I think it might be as low as only a 70% replacement in Germany and Poland. But you see the pattern here. We're talking about a lot of replacement.
Yeah, and the Yamnami didn't have as much success in Southern Europe?
I would guess it depends on what they wanted to do. Like sometimes whether you conquer and wipe everybody out, whether you conquer and then rule people, some of it is a choice. I mean, like when the Mongols first started expanding, the first major war they had was with a kingdom called the Qin Empire in North China. It was, the people were mostly Chinese, but the ruling class was some group of people who had been more nomads, but who had become pretty Chinese cultured, pretty acclimatized and so forth. Whereas in southern China, Sung China, that was a native dynasty. Okay. Well, the way the Mongols had trouble figuring out how to conquer walled cities, although they could win cavalry fights. Mm-hmm. But they came up with a strategy. They said, if we burn down and kill every single peasant, nobody will have anything to eat in those. And so I've seen estimates, like in McNeil's Plagues and Peoples, the Mongols may have killed more than 90% of all the people in the Qin Empire.
Were the Yamnami warriors, were they like the Mongols? Is that a reasonable comparison?
I guarantee you they weren't nearly as well organized. I mean, the Mongols were exceedingly well organized. But what I was trying to point out is when the Mongols conquered the Sung Empire, the southern part, they did not do this. There was a famous prisoner who had been sort of a bureaucrat who praised the wonders of taxation as opposed to massacre. Mm-hmm. And the Mongols were convinced. And they didn't wipe out South China. They taxed it. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened with the Europeans in, with the various conquests and so forth? I mean, like nobody knows the details. We know that in Northern Europe it was close. It was a high level of replacement, ranging from 70% up, probably. I mean, these numbers may change slightly, but it's something like that for Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. The Yamnaya mostly replaced. In Southern Europe, they didn't mostly. They showed up, and it's like, they conquered people. Maybe, farming may have been more effective in Southern Europe. I mean, these crops were developed in the Middle East. There was, they may not have worked as well in Northern Europe. I mean, we know, like in later years, people didn't so much grow wheat in places like Germany. They grew other crops that were better adapted to farther north. Like east of the Rhine into Poland and Russia, people mostly grew rye. A place like Scotland, they grew oats. Mm-hmm. Both of those are pretty hardy compared to, they can take cooler weather. It may have been that agriculture was more productive. Maybe you could get more by farming in Southern Europe as compared to raising cattle, where, it's closer in to being the same. Like suppose your crops you only figure out a way to grow them in a few crops and they don't grow super well. Switching to raising cattle might be competitive, but it's more likely to be competitive in Northern Europe than Southern Europe. Mm-hmm. But nobody knows. I mean, maybe it's hard. Like you can get hints. Like let's suppose that we see more Indo-European things in the Y chromosomes in Southern Europe, which we do in at least some places, like mm-hmm. Italy. Well, maybe you had Indo-Europeans who they conquered an area and they picked up a local girl as the wife, and then in the next generation, his son did the same thing. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, his son is now only half Indo-European, assuming the father was 100%, but he's still got exactly the same Y chromosome.
Right.
So the Y chromosome, if you had a pattern like this, this is sort of like what was happening when I talked about Fiji. The Y chromosomes went further because, mm-hmm. Maybe it's the sons and their sons. You go through 3 generations, and after a while, most people are descended in their Y chromosomes from the conquerors. Mm-hmm. But if the conquerors brought no women, you might still be mainly descended on all the other genes from the people who inhabited it before. So, but like one of the interesting things in all this is, people in Northern Europe look different from people in Southern Europe, somewhat. They also are taller. And there's actually good evidence that, and this is partly due to the Amnaya being taller in the first place, but possibly a further selection later. Anyhow, genetically, given similar diets, people from, say, Sweden are somewhat taller than, say, people from Sardinia. Mm-hmm. And Reich talks about this. And he also mentions there's certain people said, well, there's a mysterious principle that you couldn't have human groups evolve to be that different in a few thousand years. And the point is there is no such principle. It's made up. And Reich says, and we know that because we can show the genetics, how the Swedes are somewhat taller than the Sicilians or the Sardinians. And I remember, well, one thing which I sort of quarrel a little bit with Reich is he has this tendency to say, well, we don't really know it till we've got the details of the genetics. I said, but since there were already Swedes and Sardinians both living in Chicago, both with plenty to eat, back in 1930, and people would notice, hey, the Swedes are taller. That's because the Swedes are taller. Here's a related question. You know what a percheron is?
No.
The sort of big horses that they sometimes use to pull a plow in Belgium, and they pull the Anheuser-Busch wagon. Ads.
I remember the commercial.
All right. So, Clydesdales, they're another similar, very big horse. Yeah. By the way, some of these things were probably deliberately selected for horses that could carry guys wearing armor, mm-hmm. which really is heavy. Okay. Now, have you ever seen a Shetland pony?
Yes. Yeah, they're very short.
We used to have a Shetland pony. They don't put up with much shit, I can tell you that. They got mad at my cousins for shooting at it with a BB gun. Anyway,
I would hope, yeah.
Well, it caught one of them and kneeled on her and broke her collarbone. At any rate, I respected that horse. At any rate, all right.
That would make a great YouTube video if you had a recording of it. It'd probably get a lot of hits, but go ahead. Sorry.
If I just did that, and let them break my cousin's collarbone, I would have been a bad. I wasn't there. I mean, come on. I don't.
Maybe you were 8, and I don't know. But all right,
you're trying too hard. I'm not saying I approved of my cousin getting hurt. I'm also not saying I approved of them shooting at him, but that's another story. At any rate, okay. Now, there are various genes which have horses have different variants of them. Some of those variants make the horse bigger and stronger. Some of them make them smaller and clever so they can open the gate and run off like a Shetland pony. Okay. Now, if we had, suppose we had done a GWAS, a genome-wide association study for size and perhaps strength, we could eventually find the variants that explain why a Clydesdale is big as a house and why a Shetland pony is basically only good for a kid riding. We could find all that, right?
Yeah.
And if we did that, we would finally know that Clydesdales are big and that Shetland ponies are small.
Well, to put a little stronger, we would know that it wasn't the way they were raised or their diet.
But we already know that because we know that we feed those Shetland ponies, we let them out in the pasture. They get to eat all they want. We were good to our Shetland, and many other people have been good to we already knew the environments were quite comparable. Okay? All right. Now, we have related questions on you see differences between people. We won't really know they exist till we have the genetics. I mean, like, do we really know that pygmies are short? Or is this just some, are all the pygmies all growing up, being starved to death? I said, well, actually, no, they're not. And yes, we do know they're just short. And there are a bunch of things like that. I mentioned Reich's example. Are we going to finally find out that Swedes are taller than Sicilians? I said, you may finally find out, but I already knew. Mm-hmm. Now, mind you, there can be cases where it's not as clear. For example, suppose you have populations that have drastic differences in food availability. Mm-hmm. That can affect height. It has affected height. That could be, it could be because the whole country's in trouble or because the lower classes don't get what they would like to eat. Yeah. It used to be the upper classes in England were 4 or 5 inches taller than the average Englishman. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that can happen. I said, is that happening in the United States? I said, no, we're the fattest fucking country in the world. Nobody is, it takes an eccentric, unusual situation for somebody to be really short on food. In other words, the United States, I already knew. So some of these things are like that. Mm-hmm. Yes, I was talking about alcoholism. One other thing. It turns out, you see, when alcohol is broken down, the next step is a compound called acetaldehyde. Mm-hmm. And acetaldehyde is kind of toxic. It makes you feel sick to your stomach. And it turns out the adaptations that people have that protect them against alcoholism, what they do is they maximize acetaldehyde so that you feel crappier when you drink. And they do it 2 ways. One of them, some of the mutations more rapidly produce it. So you tend to have a higher level because it's the alcohol is being broken down rapidly. So you end up with kind of a pulse of acetaldehyde that makes you feel like crap. The other way is there's a next step where the acetaldehyde gets broken into other things. Mm-hmm. And some mutations break it down more slowly. So it hangs around and makes you feel crappy longer.
So this is the hangover effect?
Partly, but also, there are different regional variants of it. Like, there's one which you tend to get a lot of acetaldehyde if you have this gene. It's very common in East Asia. Makes you flush red.
Yeah.
You may have heard of it or seen it, but it also makes you feel crappy. As I said, but all the strategy is to maximize the unpleasantness of the acetaldehyde. So what it does is either builds it up fast or breaks it down slow. And you see different mixes of these things in different populations that have been long exposed. But I don't think we have – actually, I don't know. We might actually have some information on this, but we know that as a practical matter, Sicilians are less likely to become alcoholics than Swedes. Mm-hmm. And it boils down to is, beer or something equivalent or wine has been available since near the beginning of agriculture for these people who are descended from some of the very oldest agriculturalists. Mm-hmm. And so people in Southern Europe are somewhat more resistant to getting utterly shit-faced than people in, say, Scandinavia. Both of them, by the way, are more resistant than Eskimos or Australian Aborigines who never farmed at all. Mm-hmm. The Chinese, they're reasonably resistant, but they use different variants to give them the resistance.
Well, why are Ashkenazi Jews? I imagine we have an extremely low rate of alcoholism.
I don't know all the reasons, although I know they have some of those acetaldehyde variants. I would guess part of it is to the extent that you're descended from the Middle East, and to the remaining extent to which you're fairly strongly descended from people in Southern Europe, you should have an advantage over the average Pole.
Okay. I
mean, because they don't have much of those kinds of ancestors. They have some, but not nearly as much. So the Italians have been drinking just as long as people in Israel. Mm-hmm. Both are, descendants of the earliest farmers, distantly related to each other. Mm-hmm. Okay? So they both have had similar experience. So you take a group, which we now take some people from the Middle East, we'll call that 40%. Then we add some Italians. We're going to end up with a group that's 70% descended, 70% plus probably descended from people who are decently resistant to alcoholism. Mm-hmm. Now, it also might be, there might be extra selection if you're in a situation where if you get too drunk, you somehow suffer more than a farmer would who was too drunk. Like I could imagine it's more serious if you're running a bar to be drunk than it is if you're just visiting it.
Yeah.
Like I've heard it said, there's no worse thing for a bartender than being a guy who can't resist liquor. And for example, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, running a bar was a fairly common thing for Ashkenazi Jews to do.
Oh, safer.
Yep. It wasn't a majority thing, but, they had things they did. Like in the very early days, they still ran, of their settlement in Eastern Europe, they still did some of the money lending thing, which was kind of sort of a hybrid between being a commercial finance guy and a pawnbroker. You had guys who were, all the bureaucratic jobs they had. They had guys who were estate managers. They had guys who worked for estate managers. That's probably actually more common. They had guys who were, who were tax farmers, which is an entertaining job where you buy the right to collect this particular tax. The government gets a lump sum. You try to get more than that.
Yeah, it'll make you real hated in the community.
Well, I think any kind of collecting taxes has that effect. I'm not sure this is much worse, but yes, money lending is not actually having other people owe you money is actually kind of a dangerous thing. Now, by the way, not quite as much in Poland as it had been in Germany and the Rhineland. It's conceivable because, the amount of persecution got in Poland wasn't real high compared to what it had been back in 1200 or 1100 in Western Europe. And even there, it wasn't there all the time, but it was there some of the time. And I'm just thinking, if you're dealing with a bunch of people in town who are looking for a chance to kill you, again, being drunk might be particularly hazardous. I'm just guessing. I don't know.
Yeah. I was just thinking, if we do bring back the Neanderthals, if we clone them, they'll
be hopeless drunks.
Yeah, we should pass laws in advance that any Neanderthal is not allowed to drink. You can't serve them alcohol.
You cannot build a liquor store within 500 yards of the Neanderthal reservation.
Yeah, we should do that now, and just
that is certainly a point of view I've not run into before. Well, I respect it because
this is called
really
a future strategist. I'm very forward looking, and I
like that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And by the way, logically, there are probably other things that the Neanderthals may not be strong on, or the problems they may have particular difficulty with. Like what if, for example, there are some species in which rape is a standard strategy, like mallard ducks, okay?
Yes.
I mean, much more so than it is in any human group.
Okay.
What if Neanderthals say, but that's just the way we do it? You're telling us, look, they're not just saying she was wearing something provocative. She's saying, it's a chick. That's what we do. Do we need to have special, give them either more serious criminal penalties or, feel sorry for them and give less serious ones when they attack somebody? I don't know. But I don't actually know anything about what they did. For all you know, they were the perfect date. I doubt this, actually.
They'll probably find things we do morally abhorrent.
Like being a vegetarian or something. They were very likely fairly carnivorous because we've done analysis of their cartilage and bones, and I believe they looked like they were somewhere in terms of how carnivorous they were. They're in between a wolf and a fox.
Okay.
Which is very few human groups are like. I mean, Eskimos might be close. There weren't a whole lot of vegetables to eat up on the high Arctic. But anyhow, back to these Indo-Europeans. We know some things about them by their technology and their artifacts. We know at first they seem to, they were cattle raisers. Mm-hmm. And it shows up a lot when they do these linguistic analysis. There's all kinds of words about cattle and how important cattle are. And, and there's myths. And, there are actually myths that at least parts of the myth seem to go back to these common ancestry of the different European peoples. For example, somebody was analyzing, old, literally, myths and fairy stories. They came up with one they think goes back to the common origin of all the Western European, Indo-European groups.
Really? Is that because they look at different myths in different areas? And they
look for common shared things and older versions and so forth. Now, by the way, this is kind of a new, but it's similar to the linguistic archaeology thing. It's a mythological archaeology, you might call it. But it's not crazy. It might make sense. But the one that seems the oldest one is that they know. That isn't in all of the groups, I should say. There's actually something about fighting a dragon that may go back all the way to the beginning of Indo-Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
But this one it's Rumpelstiltskin.
Really?
But again, from the linguistic analysis, they think they know some things. It seems to have been kind of a patriarchal society, at least in the words they use to trace relationships and things. Instead they would typically talk more about the things on your father's side of the family in terms of how you were related. We know something about some of their technology. We know that they were probably pretty warlike. The fact that all we find is these graves with weapons in them. As I said, we used to call this group the battle axe culture. Later, I think there was some sort of pottery these guys used that they called corded ware. But battle axe is more descriptive, which is why they stopped using it, because they didn't like, this whole picture of people going around conquering and replacing people. They would usually treat this with contempt, but it's clearly what happened.
Yeah.
To varying extents. I think in Southern Europe, the previous population survived a lot more. So, by the way, of course, that's compatible with all kinds of war and conquest. There's lots of patterns of war and conquest in which at least most people survive. Every single country in World War II, most people survived. That doesn't mean the World War II wasn't actually kind of severe.
Yeah.
So we don't know. But when the places where they don't survive, where 7% of the English ancestry, a maximum 7%, goes back to the people who built Stonehenge, the early farmers, I said they hit them pretty hard.
Yeah. Of course, it could have been the diseases they brought, right? We can't.
People have suggested that, and I can say a little about it. There was a form of the Black Plague which genetic analysis has found in some of these Yamnaya. Not exactly like today, but it was there. But I would argue to really have a crushing impact, you need for the people exposed to have not seen it before. But we know that it's not like the Yamnaya had a huge wall around them that they suddenly burst through. They traded with the other people who before they started making their moves to invade.
Oh, okay.
They weren't. And the other thing is the cases where these things really, really make a difference, if the population has been long isolated from everybody, so they just don't have much disease and they haven't had much, in other words, like American Indians.
Yeah.
The American Indians, they were terribly damaged by a wave of many different diseases, none of which they'd seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I've seen estimates, it's looking like they've lost more than 90% of the population, really comparable to an atomic war. Yeah. But that was the sum. It was that none of them had any special adaptations towards malaria, which many people in the old world had. They didn't have any towards smallpox, which, by the way, we haven't identified, but since Europeans do better, they must have some. They didn't have anything against against all kinds of things that had become big problems for a long time in the old world. Now, there is no way that the early farmers of Europe were as shielded from disease as the American Indians were. It can't be.
Right.
And there's also no way in which the incoming Yamnaya were as tough against disease as Europeans were in 1500. Remember, this is an earlier period.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's unlikely, but I could be wrong. But I'll tell you, I don't think they brought 10 big new diseases, every one of which they were adapted to, none of which the previous inhabitants of Europe were.
Mm-hmm.
That is what happened in 1500 with Columbus and the Columbian expansion. That it can't be what happened. Another thing is a lot of these things that look like somehow, women, like you look at Y chromosomes and things, it looks like the Yamnaya men contributed a lot more than women, and whereas the previous inhabitants men contributed a lot less. Mm-hmm. This is not a super likely outcome of pure disease.
So it would have had to, if it was a disease, it would have had to be a disease that was more deadly to men than women.
Well, I don't really, other than minor differences, I don't really know of any like that.
Yeah.
Again, it's not impossible.
It could be a behavior. It's unlikely, but it could be some behavioral thing too, right? Where
my favorite model, considering we find all these, all our linguistic stuff talks about, like there are things you can reconstruct as shared hints and later populations descended. Mm-hmm. One of them is something, there seems to have been this thing where young men, sort of late teenagers, up to about 20 or something, seem to have sort of split off from the community and formed kind of a warrior group that went out and attacked the neighbors. Mm-hmm. Not under very good control by the authorities, and was usually sort of a separate society for a while until they decided it was time to settle down and get a girl and farm, or actually I should say probably raise cattle instead of being a bandit. And these groups were, this is what's projected for early Indo-European history, and that these groups were referred to as something like the wolves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. And there's even suggestions, and again, partly from legends and shared things, but Christ, even from archaeology, that one of the things they did was they would raise a dog when they were in these groups from a puppy, and then when it grew up, they would kill it themselves as a mark of toughness.
Yeah.
And they have found something that looks very much like this in one of the early Yamnaya groups, where these dogs, they're all dogs, they're not wolves, they're like 6 years old, they're all cut into little tiny pieces. And I'll say, I don't know if we would have, one thing Reich does a lot, and I think it's bullshit. He's always talking about admixture, the joys of admixture. We're all products of admixture. We should embrace admixture. So, should the Indians have embraced Spanish admixture? I said, if they had been able to defeat the Spanish, and they had done so, which some people did in some regions, at least for a while, I'd say they had a perfect right to try.
Yeah.
Is there something they have to submit to the invaders? Now, by the way, if you said, but there's a lot you could learn from the Spanish, I said, true. There's no reason you couldn't have tried to learn it. But the idea that it's a wonderful thing when they come and burn your capital to the ground or something, I don't think that's necessarily true. By the way, although for the Aztecs, at least you can make a case they had it coming. But he talks about it as if, this was a mysterious and happy process. And I don't think it was very often. When we had those guys come and they apparently killed most of the Taiwanese type men on Fiji, said, I bet they didn't like it a bit.
Yeah.
I said, what's the most reasonable thing to do? I said, try to defend yourself. Now, by the way, with disease, the American Indians, boy, it's kind of impossible to defend yourself.
Yeah, they were in a hopeless position.
Nobody knew what to do. Well, suppose for some reason the Europeans had obeyed the Prime Directive, which, by the way, never happens even on Star Trek, but suppose they had. Suppose the only thing they'd ever done was have a few small trading posts in various parts of North and South America. Diseases would mostly have made it across anyhow. Yeah. And you still would have had this great crisis, even if the Spanish – by the way, the Spanish didn't welcome it. They would have there would be a guy who was a soldier of Cortez that says, you are now a baron. You have a valley, and there's 5,000 people living into it, and they're supposed to pay you some taxes. And 150 years later, what it is a lackadaisical ranch with his descendants living on it, and everybody's half Indian, and there's only 200 people left in the valley. Mm. That's how bad it was. They would have been happier to be lords of a rich and prosperous land, but it collapsed underneath them, and not on purpose. Although, it is true, if it hadn't collapsed, it's possible the Indians would have successfully revolted and kicked them out, particularly in early days. Mm-hmm. But still, anyhow. But yeah, there's every reason to think that the Yamnaya were somewhere between, probably my model for them is somebody like the Comanche. And by the way, the Comanche were mean. People were afraid of them. Everybody hated them.
Yeah, they would torture people before killing them, wouldn't they?
Well, yeah. Although I can only think of one or two movies that are actually realistic enough to show anything like that. It was like one of the last of there was sort of people made a few westerns where they tried to be realistic, which makes it kind of a depressing western. It was Alzana's Raid with Burt Lancaster. Decent movie. But, you have people shooting themselves rather than be captured by the Comanches. And it wasn't totally crazy. It was bad. By the way, a little cannibalism could, spice up what happened there too. But the Yamnaya, they spread all over Europe. One place where they didn't impose their language, which was the Basque territory, you still see some DNA from there. In fact, quite a bit, particularly of a particular Y chromosome. Who knows what happened there? But the Yamnaya, some of them in the group that had moved up in Germany expanded very far to the east. And in fact, there are places that used to be Indo-European that have since been, like it looks like Finland used to be Indo-European, then was conquered by Finnish speakers. Mm-hmm. And I'm beginning to wonder if there's not some other areas of northern Russia where the same thing happened. But anyhow, some of the Yamnaya spread east and they got all the way to the Urals. And we have found artifacts and things in the Urals. And where one thing they did a lot of metalworking, because there's a lot of metal ores and things, and also wood to make charcoal to reduce it and so forth. So they did quite a bit with metallurgy, and it appears some groups in that vicinity invented the chariot, which led to another phase of Indo-European expansion. These guys went south and eventually conquered Iran and India, which is apparently controversial in India, but I suppose for all I know, it's controversial in Iran, but I haven't heard any Iranian comments on it. But they have recently, found some DNA work about, you see, there was this, again, 1930 is back when the theories were in good shape. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, for example, there was a guy in the late 20s, who wrote a book called The Aryans, in which he describes the prehistory of Europe as you have a bunch of guys from the Middle East who are farmers and not real big, who settle almost all of Europe with farming, and then later you have some guys come off the Russian steppes, conquer them, and impose Indo-European languages. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this book was largely correct, not in every detail. Again, we know we had all sorts of tools he didn't have. Mm-hmm. Back in 1926, Gordon Child, an Australian archaeologist, he was pretty sound on this. And then for years, then after a while, people didn't want to hear it anymore. That's really what it was. It wasn't because of all the evidence they found that nobody ever moved, nobody ever conquered. There was no such evidence. They just said, we don't want it to be that way, and we're going to pretend it wasn't. Yeah. In fact, even he didn't talk about his work later in his life. See, part of it was you had Nazis saying, well, we're descendants of the Aryans who were great conquerors and so forth.
Well, are the Aryans the Yamnami? Is Aryans another word for it? Okay.
Well, actually, the Aryans was, mostly in this later expansion, which is the groups that expanded, a common phrase they used themselves, which probably means something like the people or, the right people or something. They would use words that were Aryans or close to that. For in Iran, the word Iran itself is derived from that, and also in India. Okay, I don't know if anybody was using that particular word as early as when they moved into Germany and Poland. Mm-hmm. But they were using it in the expansions, a later expansion, which is about 1500 BC. Okay. This eastern branch that conquered India and so forth. So there were guys in the late 30s who said, British mainly, who were saying, we think there were other people here who were, part of the Indian ancestry, and then we had Indo-Europeans moved down and conquered northern India and Iran, and that's where the majority languages. I mean, there are actually other languages, like the Dravidian languages in South India, mm-hmm. but the majority of people speak Indo-European languages. And by the way, that they now have some recent ancient DNA. One of my favorite phrases from India and the Indus civilization, mm-hmm. and yeah, that's what it was. But there are certain people in India who've invented other theories they like, partly because they're not theories the British put forth, but they're also wrong. What the ancient DNA shows is there was an aboriginal population in India, kind of like the hunter-gatherers of Europe. Mm-hmm. They've had guys move in from the Middle East, from the eastern part of the Middle East, from Iranian-type area, mm-hmm. who brought, the standard Middle Eastern crops and things. And I think they also developed some in India. And they sort of merged with this population that was already there in India. And the merger was closer to a merger of equals than it was in Europe. In Europe, the great majority of ancestry is from the farmers from the Middle East. It's probably closer to – I would guess the majority, at least at this stage, was from the hunter-gatherers who lived in India. Mm-hmm. But it was 40-60. I'm not sure. But anyhow, and that's the Indus civilization. It's formed by these people who moved from the Middle East and mixed with the local people in India. And then later, Indo-Europeans show up, conquer the place, their language spreads. And today, there are, the majority, the biggest chunk of ancestry is from the original population. Probably the amount that's from the Middle East and the amount that's from the horse riding nomad Indo-Europeans is about similar. Call it 15 or 20% each, and the rest is the people who were there earlier, whose distant cousins of the people in the Andaman Islands. For some reason, there are people in India developed certain ideologically favored explanations, which I think never had any actual support at all, and this completely pulls the rug out from under them. But I mean, I don't know what their reaction will be. No, I haven't heard of anybody getting lynched yet, though. That's good. But you can find all kinds of totally meaningless comments saying, "Well, you haven't really proven X." The answer is actually Reich has. At least, for some of these questions, at least. Certainly, we don't know every detail.
Okay. With the Yunnan, were they the last major group to invade Europe?
There have, in terms of making a really big difference, I would say yes. Again, there are things at the edges. I mean, for example, you can find some North African ancestry in Spain from the time of the Arab, which was probably in those days mostly Berber conquest. I mean, it's not majority, but there's some, 15% or something in southern Spain. You can find this and that in various places. I mean, the Ashkenazi Jews are a product of a more recent group of people from the Middle East, of whom, by the way, we don't know a whole lot about the actual ancestors, except they're probably from the Middle East. We might know more soon if somebody bothers to look closely at that. But anyhow, they're 40% that. There are, Hungarians have some people from the East, although they're mostly similar to their neighbors, like, Austrians and Germans and Poles in their ancestry. One recent expansion, although it was itself a particular Indo-European group, was the expansion of the Slavs, sort of in the late years and after the Roman Empire. The Slavs are another Indo-European subgroup. They probably originated somewhere near Poland or Western Russia. And for some reason, they had a way of life that seemed to work pretty well when other people's was disintegrating. Like when the Eastern Roman Empire, much of it was falling apart, Slavs would move into these places and do okay. So these people expanded from this area up in northeastern Europe. They expanded to a little bit west, up north, up into Prussia. They expanded a long way into Russia. They expanded to the south into Yugoslavia and Greece. Greece has a significant amount of Slavic ancestry, but the language didn't stick. But various Slavs moved into places in Greece, and you can see it if you look at their genetics. Maybe it's 15% of the ancestry, and it's all in mainland Greece. There's none of it in the islands. The Byzantines held on to all the islands. But during the various times in the Middle Ages when things were going poorly for the Byzantines, their people just sort of wander in, land somewhere, start farming, kill a few people, get in the way. Over much longer periods, mix in with the rest of the Greeks. This is why you can actually find somebody blonde in Greece occasionally. That's actually one interesting thing. Like if you look at the Sardinians, what fraction of Sardinia, they're the purest living example of the old farmers. What fraction of them, say, have red hair or blonde?
Oh, no.
Essentially zero. Now, the early farmers had kind of light skin, but, different colors of hair, all dark hair, as far as we could tell. But the Indo-Europeans, at least some of them, seem to have brought things like blondism and redheadism. And it actually also looks like that has increased with time since then. Like you were talking about, how have people changed in the past on an earlier question? I mean, in Europe, even these past few thousand years, there's a very interesting new technique, which takes quite a bit of high-quality data to do, but can tell you interesting things. They're looking at how have the British changed over the past 2,000 years, and they have changed. They've become more tolerant of milk. You can sort of understand that one.
Yeah.
They've become a little taller. Babies have gotten bigger heads. Women have gotten wider hips, which is probably good. If the babies are going to have wider, bigger heads, people have gotten blonder. And there's all sorts of other changes that have made that basically look like stuff with insulin metabolism. I would guess it means they've gotten a little bit tougher against things like diabetes. Again, diabetes also varies a lot depending on whether you have people been farming a long time or not. People who've been farming a long time are better at dealing with a lot of carbohydrates in their diet. People who have not are not. And that has particularly, type 2 diabetes. It's a huge problem with American Indians, particularly ones that haven't farmed much. It's a huge problem with Australian Aborigines. Everybody has some problems with it, but it's not, it's not a huge problem in most of Europe I'll define a huge problem. 40% of everybody on the Navajo reservation has type 2 by the time they're 40. Okay. What are numbers in some place like Germany? I don't remember exactly, but they're a lot less. 10% by 60 or 20% by 60, something like that. China also doesn't have a fantastic problem with it. Mm-hmm. But basically hunter-gatherers generally do. It wouldn't surprise me if the Mediterranean peoples are more resistant to it than, Scandinavians, but I don't actually know the numbers on that, so I won't claim I know. But they ought to be, because they've been farming longer. Mm-hmm. People talk a lot about the advantages of the Mediterranean diet, but I wonder part of that advantage is probably just being Mediterranean. Anyhow, so the Indo-Europeans did some other things. Like some of them, went much farther east. We found some areas of Siberia that we can tell by the archaeology and actually I guess also the genetics. But there is reason to believe that some of these, after some wanderings, ended up in what's now Western China. Xinjiang, the westernmost province of China, mm-hmm. we found a lot of documents that go back about 1,200, 1,300 years. There used to be a population that lived. These were basically oasis towns along what we call the Silk Route, trade routes that went along. There's a desert there, and there's mountains to the north and south of this desert, and there's some water comes down from those mountains, and so people can farm in certain areas on the north. And one of them is one branch of the Silk Road. The other is the other. Towns like Kashgar, mm-hmm. which just has a neat exotic sound to it, if you ask me, by the way. Anyhow, there are still people who are at least partly related to these people living there. Uyghurs. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of Chinese who are recently moved there. The Uyghurs wish they could be independent of China and say, well, we used to live here and you've conquered it and settled it full of Chinese, to which the answer is, yep, and there's probably not much they can do about it. But it used to be they were the main population, and there was a time in which they spoke an Indo-European language, one that we hadn't even known existed. But we found these written records from around 800 A.D. In several of these towns. Many of them were Buddhist scriptures translated into this language. But since we, knew what those books were in other languages and in various Indian or Chinese languages, we could then easily translate them. And then all of a sudden we knew a new language, which was dubbed Tocharian because there used to be some people named Tocharian who lived within 1,000 miles of this area. It's probably a crappy name, but it sounds nice, so that's all I care. Anyhow, the funny thing about Tocharian is, we have a whole new Indo-European language. And by the way, you can see signs of it because they will find mummies in the sand in these deserts of guys who are 6 feet tall redheads. Mm-hmm. And you can actually see the occasional little red-headed kid who also looks a bit Chinese running around some of these towns. Mm-hmm. There are still ancestry. Some of the ancestry in this region still comes from this population. And so their language, it was sort of odd because it had some similarities, but it seemed to be to far Western Indo-European languages. Like it had some similarities to Celtic mm-hmm. or Latin. But it's there, and we can read it. And so that's another part of the information they use in figuring out things about the early days of the Indo-Europeans. So I'm trying to think, of course, if we count after Columbus and everything, Indo-European languages spread further yet. Today, probably just under half of the human race has an Indo-European language as their native language. Mm-hmm. And probably the most important international language is English, which, of course, is also a rather complicated, mixed-up Indo-European language that's, the core is Germanic with all kinds of French and Latin and, all sorts of other random words stuck in it. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, one of the interesting things about all this is how the linguists did not go too far wrong. They just didn't. I mean, all the archaeologists were telling you all your ideas about peoples expanding and conquering, that's all wrong. The linguists, as far as I can tell, simply ignored them. That was right. Another group of people who were relatively isolated from the nonsense, archaeologists in Eastern Europe.
Oh.
You see, evidently, political correctness, like evidently if you're already a communist, it kind of shields you from political correctness. So, by the way, a lot of that work didn't always get well understood in the West because you probably had to learn to read Bulgarian or Russian or something. But there was lots of work about the early farmers because, some of their biggest and most interesting things are in the Balkans. Mm-hmm. So places in Yugoslavia, places in Romania, places in Bulgaria. That's where a lot of the most important digs were. There were also, and it's for the Indo-European things, lots of, most of that area is in Russia. There was a whole branches of Russian archaeology, and they didn't always get together very much with Western archaeologists, which may have been a good thing, as we now see. Right. But by the way, it was so fashionable that even people who are about as reasonable as people get in this area, even when they thought that there had been expansion off the steppe of people and languages, they would say, but it's mostly just, somehow they persuaded people or, their stories were so good that people learned the language to learn them. I mean, we're trying to think of peaceful mechanisms to spread. It does happen. It just doesn't happen very much, and it happened less in prehistory. Some of this stuff is the things that happens in more sophisticated cultures, where you have things like money and books and stuff like that. But, for example, there's a guy named David Anthony who did a lot of good work, has a good book out called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. It's about trying to understand the beginnings of the Indo-Europeans. Mm-hmm. And the first part of the book is a short but very well-done explanation of the linguistics. And the second part is a whole lot of obscure but unfortunately important Russian archaeology. And you will go mad just trying to remember the names of all the different towns and places where they found these things and stuff. But he originally assumed that somehow these languages had spread by something other than the movement of the people who spoke it. Or at least mostly. Mostly it was people, don't you wish you were Indo-European too? Wouldn't you learn it the way people learn French when it was the language of diplomacy or something? And I think he was probably a little surprised. He works with Reich and Patterson and so forth. He gets to see things as they happen. I'm sure he's pretty convinced that things weren't quite as happy as he once dreamed. He was, for example, involved in that thing with the sacrificed dogs. Oh. Although even then there were odd parts of it. He said, because it's really hard for people to learn how to kill other people. And I'm thinking, what am I supposed to do? Demonstrate that that's false? Because there have been people who have tried to make such arguments. That it's really hard to get people to learn to, chop an enemy down in the heat of battle. Says, I don't really think so. I'm pretty sure that's always been something people were pretty good at doing. And if they weren't good, they learned in the first about as soon as there was a guy in front of them with a weapon.
Well, you think if you did any hunting, that would get you.
Well, you see, look, we have cultural problems in understanding the past. Most people who are highly educated in this country, even more so going to social sciences, never hunted anything in their life, never hung out with anybody who did, and it feels strange to them. Now, intellectually, they probably know that a lot of people did do this, one hopes, but they don't feel like they really believe it. Real people couldn't have shot a deer, drained its blood, gutted it, cooked it, and eaten it. That's just not possible, right? Yeah. But, how much have you hunted?
Oh, never. Well, on video games quite a bit, but...
Well, maybe that'll turn this around, yeah. Did you eat anything in the video game? I'm just curious. Do they do that?
See, most recently I've been hunting zombies in virtual reality video games.
I don't think which one?
Can't eat them. Which game? What's it called? I forgot. Death something?
Oh, God, at least it's not the one my kids are always playing. I have enough of that one.
What do they play?
Something that's a little obsolete, but they like it. Right. It's a killing zombie game. I don't remember.
I think, but
no, it's older than that. At any rate, whatever they're doing is. At any rate, it's hard for people to believe that anybody wasn't exactly like them. Now, I think I have a relative strength because I don't believe anybody was ever exactly like me, and that gives me an advantage. I don't even believe that the average professor is exactly like me. Now, by the way, I have never done much hunting, partly because there isn't a whole lot in central Illinois. There's just farms. But, for example, I went out with my dad and a couple of an uncle and some cousins. They had a dog they were going to use to catch a raccoon, which we knew was living in a dead hollow tree in some area back behind where my uncle lived, out in the countryside, a place where there actually were some trees. And it was, we start a fire. The raccoon comes out. It jumps into a neighboring creek. They're very good in water. Mm-hmm. And the dog jumps after him because, see, a real coon dog would be hesitant because they know the coons are very good in water. But this dog didn't know anything. And it jumps in, and immediately the raccoon holds its head under. And the normal reaction of dogs is that I'm going to die. I give up. But we waded in because it wasn't very deep, and we, yelled and screamed and got the raccoon out. And then we had to give the dog artificial respiration. And that dog was always kind of slow after that. Okay, that's my hunting story. But I find it possible to imagine that people got hungry and shot deer and ate them. And I think for a lot of people that's hard. Well, let me give you an example. There was a young lady who I think she was doing this work at Stanford. She was trying to look at the genetics of the Yamnaya moving into Northern Europe, recent contemporary stuff. And she thought she had found evidence. There are a couple of ways to do this. One is by looking at Y chromosomes and mitochondria, but you can also look at differences on the X chromosome. See, the X chromosome, mainly 2/3 of the times it comes from the mother, 1/3 from the male. So you can also see some evidence. Like, suppose the question is, was this group that invaded mostly male? Did it mostly replace, or was it disproportionately male? Another kind of evidence you can look for is on the X chromosome. Mm-hmm. Okay, perfectly reasonable. And she did some work that indicated that there was a highly male-biased invasion. By the way, I'm not sure that analysis is right. The Reich and Patterson didn't think so. They think it's hard to tell. But that's not the important point. I mean, look, when we do find a way to find out, that will be interesting. But her point was she suggested that she thought that, to a very large extent, the fathers of the next generation were the Yamnaya rather than the local men. And she came pretty close to the video game theory. Her theory was, well, Yamnaya, they probably do interesting things. And there's something that's attractive about them. So the women just walk over to them and marry them and leave the local guys. And all of this is done without any violence. Mm-hmm. I don't believe it. My theory says that those local farmers gave up their local chicks when they were dead. Now,
or they knew they had no hope.
By the way, there are actually interesting patterns. There were certain Y chromosomes that were pretty common in some of these earlier farm groups that are rare today. Hint, hint. But they're less rare in certain places, like certain areas way up in the mountains or sometimes on islands. Mm. Like there are areas up in the Apennines in Italy where you can find where other places, like overall Italy as a whole, G2A, Y chromosome, which was probably the majority of guys had it. Among the early farmers, this one particular variety of Y chromosome. Today it was majority then. It's around 1% in Italy now. Maybe something happened, but it happened less than the Apennines, where it got up to 8 or 11%. There's some mountains in central France, the Massif Central. Okay, you can find some of these, from the old days. There's more of those guys, when they gave up, I think they hid. They went to places the other guys didn't want as much. Yeah. This is all. By the way, there are actually kind of similar patterns in some places where invaders came at the end of the Roman Empire, where sometimes people still speaking Latin held out. For example, there were people in the Balkans. A lot of Slavs were moving in, but there are still people who spoke a language and they're an ethnic group. They're called Vlachs, Vlachs, and they speak something that's kind of related to Romanian, and they tended to survive as shepherds up in hills that weren't really any good for farming, and scattered all over the Balkans. There were, until very recently, probably still are some, Vlachs. They were still speaking a Romance language. So the point is people, people just don't lie there. They usually hide to the extent or they go somewhere that nobody else wants. Mountains can be like that. Islands sometimes can be like that. But anyhow, all this, Amy Goldberg was making this argument that, maybe women just found the Yamnaya more attractive. And I'm saying, I don't think it would have mattered if they had. If, we have some little village that hasn't been destroyed yet, it says, well, but they're taller. By the way, they may have been a little bit taller. Mm-hmm. Or some of them are blonde, which everybody says, what is that anyhow? Isn't that weird? By the way, I've heard people say, well, blondes are, they're sexually selected. Everybody finds it attractive. I said, I will bet you the first time anybody saw somebody who's blonde, they thought they were a freak or a ghost or something. Somebody just looked entirely different. I bet it wasn't a huge plus.
Yeah.
I bet. By the way, there's one interesting thing. There was another group of people who appears to have lived close to the Indo-Europeans because there are borrowings back and forth in their languages. Mm. The group of people that were the root of the people who spoke the Finnish and that family of languages, Finno-Ugrians, they lived in forest areas not very much farther north in Russia. And you can, by the way, this helps pin down was it really the Yamnaya? I said, well, whoever was, first, we had the linguistics. We knew that they were near certain other groups by the linguistic borrowings. There were many hints, but you see, it used to be there was sort of a contest. See, who can come up with the origin for the Indo-European languages that is the stupidest? See, what people would usually do says, well, this was an important piece of history. These people really amounted something. So they must have arisen in my backyard. So German scholars would say, well, the Indo-Europeans must have originated in Germany. And Iranians knew that it, recently that's what they were saying in India. They must have originated in India. But they didn't. Because, I mentioned those hunter-gatherers in India that have sort of a distinct genetic profile. Mm-hmm. Everybody in India's got some of that. If you left India, you'd still have some of it. But you look at populations outside of India, hardly any of them have it. And even then they're close, like just over the border in Iran or something. By the way, when I say India, geographically, that includes Pakistan. Is there sign that these people with this signature have moved very far out of India? I said, we know they didn't. It's not there. Mm-hmm. But, it's local. It's inside baseball Indian politics. I don't pretend to know a lot about it. It just happens to be mistaken. I can't say they're crazier than us. That would be...
They're crazy in different ways.
I'd kind of say they were less crazy than us right now, but that's another story. The linguistic stuff, one of the things about it is it never told you dates. Although it could tell you some things. Like you could say, these people, it was after copper was being used when we had this group split off to become the different Indo-European groups because they share a word for copper. The technology tells you something. Right. People were not incredibly wrong. The people who were incredibly wrong were the archaeologists who simply said, we don't like hearing about Aryan conquest. Again, like I said, the Germans would say, we are the descendants of a group that expanded and conquered much of the world, and half the languages of the world are descended from it. And these groups were the Aryans. I said, well, they probably called themselves different in 3000 BC, but that is what they called themselves by the time they conquered Iran and India. And you are partly descended from them, perhaps 40%, along with some admixture from the earlier farmers and hunter-gatherers and so forth. But you're still Hitler. You're still an asshole. None of this helps. And the guy says, if the Nazis believed it, we can't believe it. I said, well, the Nazis probably believed in brushing your teeth. What are you going to do?
Yeah, that's the saying. Reverse stupidity is not intelligence. So you can't reverse what Hitler said, and that's what's right.
The Nazis were early believers that smoking caused lung cancer and should be stopped. Yes. Earlier than anywhere else. By the way, it wasn't just partly it was just German researchers, but the actual government latched onto it and agreed with it. So it was Nazis to some extent pushing this. Mm-hmm. And it actually got in the way later because people started doing similar epidemiology and saying, boy, it makes a real difference if you smoke. And there were people who would say, well, that's what the Nazis said. Are you going to listen to this guy? This was essentially in the early 50s. There were people who used that as an argument. I said, I'm sure the argument said that you should make the armor on the front of your tank thick. The point is, you could say, you can't believe it just because a Nazi said it. True. But you can't disbelieve it either just because a Nazi said it. But that was part of it. There was also resonances that I had probably never participated in enough to really understand the emotional feelings involved. But people say, but all this smacks of colonialism. I said, yeah, what's your point? I mean, colonialism, or groups expanding, dominating each other, that's happened every now and then. You've done it probably. I mean, assuming you're a member of a very large group, because how did the Bantu get over most of Africa? Well, they moved out, they farmed, and they beat the people who were there before, along with mixing with them to some extent. I said, what about the Chinese? I said, well, they used to mostly be a group in South China. They expanded, also incorporating later groups. But yeah, they chased a lot of people clear out of China down into Southeast Asia. Well, what about Southeast Asia? Well, they used to be occupied by short, dark people who only exist in few little areas now. And somebody from South China replaced and conquered them, and so on, and so on. I mean,
so we're the descendants of the people who were the successful at conquering and mostly killing.
There are a few people who managed to hide somewhere, or go someplace nobody else wanted. That's probably true a little bit of the Sardinians. Although, even there, before they landed in Sardinia, there were probably people there who were some sort of hunter-gatherer. And they probably mostly replaced them, the guys who were farmers of some sort. So, but I'll tell you, it's been probably 7,000 years since the last big replacement on Sardinia. So that's another interesting thing is a lot of American groups until Columbus and so forth, there weren't as many waves of replacement in the Americas. Not as many, some probably, but you don't find the same tendency to find a huge area with people all speaking related language. You may, medium-sized areas maybe, but not, not a whole continent or something. Like Bantu languages cover most of southern Africa, or related Niger Kordofanian languages. Semitic covers and related languages covers pretty much all of North, even counting before Arabic replaced it, people were speaking languages distantly related to Arabic. The Berber languages are they're called Afroasiatic languages. Ancient Egyptian was distantly related to Arabic and Hebrew and so forth. So, but this is a widespread all the way across North Africa. Today, much of the Middle East, even in Roman times, all of it, actually not all of it, but most of it today, not Iran, but the rest of it, pretty much. So if you're a member of a really large group, typically that expanded and rolled over some other people. I think the only way to avoid it is you move, like American Indians in North America, they may not have rolled over anybody. There may have been nobody there before. But that's another story.
Yeah, we should talk about that some other day.
I will say one hint, though. One thing people noticed in doing, which helped elucidate the Indo-European stuff, they noticed they could measure these degrees of relatedness using these interesting algorithms on these tremendous amounts of data we recovered. And they found that the Northern Europeans were, for example, more closely related to American Indians than Southern Europeans were. And it was clear. It was also true that they were more closely related to American Indians than they were to, say, the Chinese or Koreans. And it turned out that there was part of the ancestry of the original Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya, was a group, what they finally deduced was there ought to be a group that contributed some groups moving east and some moving west. Part of that group must have joined the American Indians. Part of it must have joined the Indo-Europeans. And later they found some bones deep in Siberia that had exactly the genetics needed to come up to have the right degree of relatedness this is an interesting thing. They could deduce that a certain population existed from patterns of the genetics, even when nobody in that population exists today, at least not in pure form, and when they don't even have any skeletons of them yet. They're just saying, it's like there were certain reactions where energy was apparently disappearing. Nuclear reactions, you couldn't see where it went. So Enrico Fermi said, there must be a small, hard-to-detect particle being emitted. Since I'm Italian, I will call it the little neutral one, the neutrino. But the point is, he was right, and later it was detected. So, see, at first that particle existed only as something that logically should exist, but there was no direct evidence for it. This group in northern Siberia, for a while, it was a group that had to exist, but there was no direct evidence of it. And then they found it, which we are typically calling the ancient North Eurasians, although I like to call them the Cybermen, mainly because some of my kids are Doctor Who fans. But there, anyhow. So we kind of know, by the way, there's still details to be straightened out. There was a very, very early branch off the Indo-European language tree, which is clearly related, but, people are arguing about whether they really came off the group from the out on the plains or not. The Hittites and the related languages. Right now, I'd say we're still working it out. I don't think we know. But we will.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We should probably wrap it up.
Okay.
Is there, so the Yamada done, Yamani. Yamnaya done extremely well genetically. And
oh, yeah. I mean, Yamnaya landed on the moon, or people who are partly Yamnaya.
Yes. And
those are the only people who have landed on the moon. They've all been partly Yamnaya, I might add. Every one of them. I think.
Probably quite nasty people.
Well, you can't make an omelet without evidently breaking millions of eggs and heads. I would guess that they were. Although, we don't. We know at least that the earlier farmers were not as successful at violence as the Yamnaya were. But, they may have been mean. Maybe they just weren't very good at it.
Yeah,
again, we know they weren't perfect because we certainly found cases where villages, this is an era where they're the only people living there, where somebody got completely massacred and, man, women and child, everybody killed. We've seen occasional cases of that, but we know nothing about the reasons or anything.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Greg, and thank you all for listening to The Future Strategist. If you like this podcast, please give it a high ranking on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts so more people are likely to find it. Also, please consider joining the podcast's Facebook group, which is just called Future Strategist. Greg blogs at westhunt.wordpress.com. Goodbye.